Chapter 4.
Almost before Jane had finished putting clean sheets on Mark's bed, Miss Dimble, with a great many parcels, arrived.
You're an angel to have me here for the night. We'd tried every hotel in Edgestowe, I believe. This place is going to become unendurable. The same answer everywhere, all full up with the hangers-on and camp followers of this detestable NICE. Secretaries here, typists there, commissioners of works. The thing's outrageous. If Cecil hadn't had a room in college, I really believe he'd have had to sleep in the waiting room at the station. I only hope that man in college has aired the bed.
But what on earth has happened?
Turned out, my dear.
But it isn't possible, Miss Dimble. I mean, it can't be legal.
That's what Cecil said. Just think of it, Jane. The first thing we saw when we poked our heads out of the window this morning was a lorry on the drive with its back wheels in the middle of the rose bed, unloading a small army of what looked like criminals with picks and spades. Right in our own garden. There was an odious little man in a peaked cap who talked to Cecil with a cigarette in his mouth. At least it wasn't in his mouth, but secatined onto his upper lip, you know. And guess what he said? He said they'd have no objection to our remaining in possession. Of the house, mind you, not the garden. Till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. No objection!
But surely it must be some mistake.
Of course, Cecil rang up your bursar, and of course your bursar was out. That took nearly all morning, ringing up again and again, and by that time the big beech that you used to be so fond of had been cut down, and all the plum trees. If I hadn't been so angry, I'd have sat down and cried my eyes out. That's what I felt like. At last Cecil did get on to your Mr. Busby, who was perfectly useless. Said that there must be some misunderstanding, but it was out of his hands now, and we'd better get on to the NICE at Belbury. Of course, it turned out to be quite impossible to get them, but by lunchtime we saw that one simply couldn't stay there for the night, whatever happened.
Why not?
My dear, you've no conception what it was like. Great lorries and traction engines roaring past all the time, and a crane on a thing like a railway truck. Why, our own tradesmen couldn't get through it. The milk didn't arrive till 11 o'clock. The meat never arrived at all. They rang up in the afternoon to say their people hadn't been able to reach us by either road. We had the greatest difficulty in getting into town ourselves. It took us half an hour from our house to the bridge. It was like a nightmare. Flares and noise everywhere, and the road practically ruined, and a sort of great tin camp already going up on the common. And the people! Such horrid men! I didn't know we had work people like that in England. Oh, horrible. Horrible.
What are you going to do?
Heaven knows. For the moment we have shut up the house, and Cecil has been at Rumble, the solicitors, to see if we can at least have it sealed and left alone until we've got our things out of it. Rumble doesn't seem to know where he is. He keeps on saying the NICE are in a very peculiar position legally. After that, I'm sure I don't know. As far as I can see, there won't be any houses in Edgestowe. There's no question of trying to live on the far side of the river any longer, even if they'd let us. Oh, indescribable. All the poplars are going down. All those nice little cottages by the church are going down. I found poor Ivy, that's your Mrs. Maggs, you know, in tears. Poor things. They do look dreadfully when they cry on top of powder. She's being turned out too. Poor little woman. She's had enough troubles in her life without this. I was glad to get away. The men are so horrible. 3 big brutes came to the back door asking for hot water, and went on so that they frightened Martha out of her wits, and Cecil had to go and speak to them. I thought they were going to strike Cecil, really, I did. It was most horribly unpleasant. But a sort of special constable sent them away.
Constable?
What? Oh yes, there are dozens of what look like policemen all over the place, and I didn't like the look of them either, swinging some kind of truncheon things, like what you'd see in an American film. Do you know, Jane, Cecil and I both thought the same thing. We thought it's almost as if we'd lost the war. Oh, good girl. Tea, that's just what I wanted.
You must stay here as long as you like, Miss Dimble. Mark'll just have to sleep in college.
Well, really, I feel at the moment that no fellow of Bracton ought to be allowed to sleep anywhere. But I'd make an exception in favour of Mr. Studdock. As a matter of fact, I shan't have to behave like the sword of Siegfried. And incidentally, a nasty, fat, stodgy sword I should be. But that side of it is all fixed up. Cecil and I are to go out to the manor at St. Anne's. We have to be there so much at present, you see.
Oh.
Why, what a selfish pig I've been. Here have I been, chattering away about my own troubles and quite forgetting that you've been out there and are full of things to tell me. Did you see Grace? And did you like her?
I saw her. I don't know if I liked her or not, but I don't want to talk about all that. I can't think about anything except this outrageous business of yours. It's you who are the real martyr, not me.
No, my dear, I'm not a martyr. I'm only an angry old woman with sore feet and a splitting head, but that's beginning to be better. She's trying to talk herself into a good temper. After all, Cecil and I haven't lost our livelihood as poor Ivy Mags has. It doesn't really matter leaving that old house. Do you know, the pleasure of living there was, in a way, a melancholy pleasure. I wonder, by the by, do human beings really like being happy? A little melancholy, yes. All those big upper rooms, which we thought we should want because we thought we were going to have lots of children, and then we never had. Perhaps I was getting too fond of mooning about them on long afternoons when Cecil was away. Pitying oneself. I shall be better away from it, I dare say. I might have got like that frightful woman in Ibsen who was always maundering about dolls. It's really worse for Cecil. He did so love having all his pupils about the place. Jane, that's the third time you've yawned. You're dropping asleep and I've talked your head off. It comes of being married for 30 years. Husbands were made to be talked to. It helps them to concentrate their minds on what they're reading. Like the sound of a weir. There, you're yawning again.
Jane found Mother Dimble an embarrassing person to share a room with because she said prayers. It was quite extraordinary, Jane thought, how this put one out. One didn't know where to look, and it was so difficult to talk naturally again for several minutes after Mrs. Dimble had risen from her knees.
Are you awake now?
Yes. I'm so sorry. Did I wake you up? Was I shouting?
Yes. He was shouting about someone being hit on the head.
I saw them killing a man. A man in a big cart driving along a country road. Then he came to a crossroads and turned off to the right past some trees. And there was someone standing in the middle of the road waving a light to stop him. I couldn't hear what they said. I was too far away. They must have persuaded him to get out of the car somehow, and there he was talking to one of them. The light fell full on his face. He wasn't the same old man I saw in my other dream. He hadn't a beard, only a mustache. He had a very quick, kind of proud way. He didn't like what the man said to him, and presently he put up his fists and knocked him down. Another man behind tried to hit him on the head with something, but the old man was too quick and turned round in time. Then it was rather horrible, but rather fine. There were 3 of them at a time, and he was fighting them all. I've read about that kind of thing in books, but I never realized how one would feel about it. Of course they got him in the end. They beat his head about terribly with the things in their hands. They were quite cool about it, and stopped down to examine him and make sure he was really dead. The light from the lantern seemed all funny. It looked as if it made long uprights of light, sort of rods all around the place. But perhaps I was waking up by then. No thanks, I'm all right. It was horrid, of course, but I'm not really frightened. Not the same way I would have been before. I'm more sorry for the old man.
You feel you can go to sleep again?
Oh, rather. Is your headache better, Miss Dimble?
Quite gone, thank you. Good night.
The committee at Belbury did not meet till 10:30, and ever since breakfast he had been walking with the Reverend Strake in the garden. Despite the raw and misty weather of the morning, at that very moment when the man had first buttonholed him, threadbare clothes and clumsy boots, the frayed clerical collar, the dark, lean, tragic face, gashed and ill-shaved, and seemed, and the bitter sincerity of his manner, had struck a discordant note. It was not a type Mark had expected to meet in the NICE.
Do not imagine that I indulge in any dreams of carrying out our program without violence. There will be resistance. They will gnaw their tongues and not repent. We are not to be deterred. We face these disorders with a firmness which will lead traducers to say we have desired them. Let them say so. In a sense we have. It is no part of our witness to preserve that organization of ordered sin which is called society. To that organization, the message which we have to deliver is a message of absolute despair.
Now, that is what I meant when I said that your point of view and mine must, in the long run, be incompatible. The preservation, which involves the thorough planning of society, is just precisely the end I have in view. I do not think there is or can be any other end. The problem is quite different for you because you look forward to something else, something better than human society in some other world.
With every thought and vibration of my heart, With every drop of my blood, I repudiate that damnable doctrine. That is precisely the subterfuge by which the world, the organization and body of death, has sidetracked and emasculated the teaching of Jesus and turned to priestcraft and mysticism the plain demand of the Lord for righteousness and judgment here and now. The kingdom of God is to be realized here, in this world, and it will be. At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. In that name, I dissociate myself completely from all the organized religion that has yet been seen in the world.
At the name of Jesus, Mark, who would have lectured on abortion or perversion to an audience of young women without a qualm, felt himself so embarrassed that he knew his cheeks were slightly reddening, and he became so angry with himself and Mr. Strake at this discovery that they then proceeded to redden very much indeed. This was exactly the kind of conversation he could not endure, and never since the well-remembered misery of scripture lessons at school had he felt so uncomfortable. He muttered something about his ignorance of theology.
Theology? It's not theology I'm talking about, young man, but the Lord Jesus. Theology is talk, eyewash, a smokescreen, a game for rich men. It wasn't in lecture halls that I found the Lord Jesus. It was in the coal pits, beside the coffin of my daughter. If they think that theology is a sort of cotton wool which will keep them safe in the great and terrible day, they'll find their mistake. For mark my words, this thing is going to happen. The kingdom is going to arrive. In this world, in this country, the powers of science are an instrument, an irresistible instrument, as all of us in the NICE know. And why are they an irresistible instrument?
Because science is based on observation.
They are an irresistible instrument because they are an instrument in his hand, an instrument of judgment as well as of healing. That is what I couldn't get any of the churches to see. They're blinded by their filthy rags of humanism, their culture, their humanitarianism, their liberalism, as well as their sins, or what they think they're sins. They are really the least sinful thing about them. And that's why I've come to stand alone, a poor, weak, unworthy old man, but the only prophet left. I knew that he was coming in power, and therefore where we see power, we see the sign of his coming.
And that is where I find myself, joining with communists and materialists and anyone else who is really ready to expedite that coming.
The feeblest of these people here has the tragic sense of life, the ruthlessness, that total commitment, the readiness to sacrifice all merely human values, which I could not find amid all the nauseating cant of the organized religions.
You mean, do you, that as far as immediate practice is concerned, there are no limits to your cooperation with the program?
Sweep away all your ideas of cooperation. Does Clay cooperate with the potter? Did Cyrus cooperate with the Lord? These people will be used. I shall be used too. Instruments, vehicles. But here comes the point that concerns you, young man. You have no choice whether you be used or not. There's no turning back once you've set your hand to plow. No one goes out of the NICE. Those who try to turn back will perish in the wilderness. The question is whether you're content to be one of the instruments which is thrown aside when it's served its turn, one which, having executed judgment on others, is reserved for judgment itself. Will you be among those who enter the inheritance? It's all true, you know. It is the saints who are going to inherit the earth, here in England, and perhaps within the next 12 months. The saints, no one else. Know you not that we shall judge angels? The real resurrection is even now taking place. The real life everlasting. Here, in this world, you will see it.
I say, it's nearly 20 past. Oughtn't we be getting to the committee?
Strake turned with him in silence, partly to avoid further conversation along the same lines, and partly because he really wanted to know the answer. Mark said presently,
A rather annoying thing has happened. I've lost my wallet. There wasn't much money in it, only about £3, but there were letters and things, and it's a nuisance. Ought I to tell someone about it?
You could tell the steward.
The committee sat for about 2 hours, and the deputy director was in the chair. His method of conducting business was slow and involved, and to Mark, with his Bracton experience to guide him, it soon became obvious that the real work of the NICE must go on somewhere else. This indeed was what he had expected, and he was too reasonable to suppose that he should find himself at this early stage in the inner ring or whatever at Belbury corresponded to the progressive element at Bracton. But he hoped he would not be kept marking time on phantom committees for too long. This morning the business mainly concerned the details of the work which had already begun at Edgestow. The NICE had apparently won some sort of victory which gave it the right to pull down the little Norman church at the corner. The usual objections were, of course, tabled, said Wither. Mark, who was not interested in architecture and who did not know the other side of the wind nearly so well as his wife, allowed his attention to wander. It was only at the end of the meeting that Wither opened a much more sensational subject. He believed that most of those present had already heard.
Why do chairmen always begin that way?
The very distressing piece of news, which it was, nevertheless, his duty now to communicate to them in a semi-official manner. He was referring, of course, to the murder of William Hengist. As far as Mark could discover from the chairman's tortuous and elusive narrative, Bill the Blizzard had been discovered with his head beaten in by some blunt instrument, lying near his car in Potter's Lane, at about 4 o'clock that morning. He had been dead for several hours. Mr. Wither ventured to suppose that it would be a melancholy pleasure to the committee to know that the NICE policemen had been on the scene of the crime before 5, and that neither the local authorities nor Scotland Yard were making any objection to the fullest collaboration. He felt that if the occasion were more appropriate, he would have welcomed a motion for some expression of the gratitude they must all feel to Miss Hardcastle, and possibly of congratulations to her on the smooth interaction between her own forces and those of the state. This was a most gratifying feature in the sad story, and, he suggested, a good omen for the future. Some decently subdued applause went on round the table at this. Mr. Wither then proceeded to speak at some length about the dead man. They had all much regretted Mr. Hengist's resolution to withdraw from the NICE, while fully appreciating his motives. They had all felt that this official severance would not in the least alter the cordial relations which existed between the deceased and almost all, he thought he could even say all, without exception, of his former colleagues in the Institute. The obituary, in Raleigh's fine phrase, was an instrument which the deputy director's talents well fitted him to play, and he spoke at great length. He concluded by suggesting they should all stand in silence for 1 minute as a token of respect for the memory of William Hengist. And they did. A world without end minutes in which odd creakings and breathings became audible, and behind the mask of each glazed and tightly lipped face, shy, irrelevant thoughts of this and that came creeping out as birds and mice creep out again in the clearing of a wood when the picnickers have gone, and everyone silently assured himself that he, at least, was not being morbid and not thinking about death. Then there was a stir and a bustle, and the committee broke up. The whole process of getting up and doing the morning jobs was more cheerful, Jane found, because she had Miss Dimble with her. Mark often helped, but as he always took the view, and Jane could feel it, even if he did not express it in words, that anything would do, and that Jane made a lot of unnecessary work, and that men could keep house with a tithe of the fuss and trouble which women made about it. Mark's help was one of the commonest causes of quarrels between them. Miss Dimble, on the other hand, fell in with her ways. It was a bright, sunny morning, and as they sat down to breakfast in the kitchen, Jane was feeling bright herself. During the night her mind had evolved a comfortable theory that the mere fact of having seen Miss Ironwood and had it all out would probably stop the dreams altogether. The episode would be closed. And now there was all the exciting possibility of Mark's new job to look forward to. She began to see pictures in her mind. Mrs. Dimble was anxious to know what had happened to Jane at St. Anne's and when she was going there again. Jane answered evasively on the first question, and Mrs. Dimble was too polite to press it. As to the second, Jane thought she wouldn't bother Miss Ironwood again, or wouldn't bother any further about the dreams. She said she had been silly, but felt sure she'd be all right now. And she glanced at the clock and wondered why Mrs. Maggs hadn't yet turned up.
My dear, I'm afraid you've lost Ivy Maggs. Didn't I tell you they'd taken her house too? I thought you'd understand she wouldn't be coming to you in the future. You see, there's nowhere for her to live in Edgestowe.
Oh, bother. What is she doing, do you know?
She's gone out to St. Anne's.
She got friends there.
She's gone to the manor, along with Cecil and me.
Do you mean she's got a job there?
Well, yes, I suppose it is a job.
Mrs. Dimble left at about 11. She also, it appeared, was going to St. Anne's, but was first to meet her husband and lunch with him at Northumberland. Jane walked down to the town with her to do a little shopping, and they parted at the bottom of Market Street. It was just after this that Jane met Mr. Curry.
You heard the news, Miss Studdock?
His manner was always important and his tone always vaguely confidential, but this morning they seemed more so than usual.
No, what's wrong?
Jane thought Mr. Curry a pompous fool and Mark a fool for being impressed by him. But as soon as Curry began speaking, her face showed all the wonder and consternation he could have wished. Nor were they this time feigned. He told her that Mr. Hengist had been murdered, Sometime during the night or in the small hours of that morning, the body had been found lying beside his car in Potter's Lane, badly beaten about the head. He had been driving from Belbury to Edgestow. Curry was at the moment hastening back to college to talk to the warden about it. He had just been at the police station. One saw that the murder had already become Curry's property. The matter was, in some indefinable sense, in his hands, and he was heavy with responsibility. At another time, Jane would have found this amusing. She escaped from him as soon as possible and went into Blackie's for a cup of coffee. She felt she must sit down. The death of Hengist in itself meant nothing to her. She had met him only once, and she had accepted from Mark the view that he was a disagreeable old man and rather a snob. But the certainty that she herself, in her dream, had witnessed a real murder shattered at one blow all the consoling pretenses with which she had begun her morning. It came over her with sickening clarity that the affair of her dreams, far from being ended, was only beginning. The bright, narrow little life, which she had proposed to live, was being irredeemably broken into. Windows into huge, dark landscapes were opening on every side, and she was powerless to shut them. It would drive her mad, she thought, to face it alone. The other alternative was to go back to Miss Ironwood, but that seemed to be only a way of going deeper into all the darkness. The manor at St. Anne's, this kind of company, was mixed up in it. She didn't want to get drawn in. It was unfair. It wasn't as if she had asked much of life. All she wanted was to be left alone. And the thing was so preposterous, this sort of thing which, according to all the authorities she had hitherto accepted, could not really happen. Kosser, the freckle-faced man with the little wisp of black mustache, approached Mark as he was coming away from the committee.
You and I have a job to do. Gotta get a report about Cure Hardy.
Does that mean I am to be in Steele's department after all?
That's right.
The reason I ask is that neither he nor you seemed particularly keen on having me. I don't want to push myself in, you know. I don't need to stay at the NICE at all if it comes to that.
Well, don't start talking about it here. Come upstairs.
They were talking in the hall, and Mark noticed Wither pacing thoughtfully toward them.
Wouldn't it be as well to speak to him and get the whole thing thrashed out?
He suggested. But the deputy director, after coming within 10 feet of them, had turned in another direction. He was humming to himself under his breath and seemed so deep in thought that Mark felt the moment unsuitable for an interview. Kosser, though he said nothing, apparently thought the same, and so Mark followed him up to an office on the 3rd floor.
It's about the village of Cure Hardy. You see, all the land at Bragdon Wood is going to be little more than a swamp once they get to work. Why the hell we wanted to go there, I don't know. Anyway, the last plan is to divert the wind, block up the old channel through Edgestow somehow. Look, here's Shillingbridge, 10 miles north of the town. It's to be diverted there and brought down an artificial channel here to the east, where the blue line is, and rejoin the old bed down there.
The university will hardly agree to that. What would Edgestow be without the river?
We've got the university by the short hairs. You didn't worry about that. Anyway, it's not our job. The point is that the new wind must come right through Cure Hardy. Now, look at the contours. Cure Hardy is in this narrow little valley. Eh? Oh, you've been there, have you? That makes it all the easier. I don't know these parts myself. Well, the idea is to dam the valley at the southern end and make a big reservoir. You'll need a new water supply for Edgestow now that it's to be the second city in the country.
But what happens to Cure Hardy?
And that's another advantage. We build a new model village. It's to be called Jules Hardy or Wither Hardy, 4 miles away, over here on the railway.
I say, you know, there'll be a devil of a stink about this. Cure Hardy is famous. It's a beauty spot. There are the 16th century almhouses and a Norman church and all that.
Exactly. That's where you and I come in. We've got to make a report about Cure Hardy. We'll run out and have a look around tomorrow. We can write most of the report today. Ought to be fairly easy. If it's a beauty spot, you can bet it's insanitary. That's the first point to stress. And then we've got to get out some facts about the population. I think you'll find it consists almost entirely of the two most undesirable elements, small rentiers and agricultural laborers.
The small rentier is a bad element, I agree. I suppose the agricultural laborer is more controversial.
The Institute doesn't approve of him. He's a very recalcitrant element in a planned community. He's always backward. We're not going in for English agriculture. So you see, all we have to do is to verify a few facts. Otherwise, the report writes itself.
That's easy enough. But before I get down to it, I'd just like to be a bit clearer about my own position. Oughtn't I to go and see Steele? I don't fancy settling down to work in this department if he doesn't want to have me.
I wouldn't do that.
Why not?
Well, for one thing, Steele can't prevent you if the DD backs you up, as he seems to be doing for the moment. For another, Steele is rather a dangerous man. If you just go quietly on with your job, he may get used to you in the end. But if you go and see him, it might lead to a bust-up. And that's another thing, too. Between ourselves, I don't think such things can go on indefinitely in this department, in the way they are at present.
The excellent training which Mark had had at Bracton enabled him to understand this. Coaster was hoping to get Steele out of the department together. He thought he saw the whole situation. Steele was dangerous while he lasted, but he might not last.
I got the impression yesterday that you and Steele hit it off together rather well.
The great thing here is never to quarrel with anyone. I hate quarrels myself. I can get on with anybody, as long as the work gets done.
Of course. By the way, if we go to Cure Hardy tomorrow, I might as well run into Edgestow and spend the night at home.
For Mark, a good deal hung on the answer to this. He might find out whether he was actually under orders from Coaster. If Coaster said, "You can't do that," he would at least know where he stood. If Coaster said that Mark couldn't be spared, that would be better still. Or Coaster might reply that he'd better consult the DD. That also would have made Mark feel surer of his position, but Coaster merely said, "Ow," leaving Mark in doubt whether one needed leave of absence or whether Mark was not sufficiently established as a member of the Institute for his absence to be of any consequence. Then they went to work on their report. It took them the rest of the day, so that Coaster and he came to dinner late and without dressing. This gave Mark a most agreeable sensation, and he enjoyed the meal too. Although he was among men he had not met before, he seemed to know everyone within the first 5 minutes and be joining naturally in the conversation. He was learning to talk their shop.
How lovely it is,
said Mark to himself the next morning as the car left the main road at Duke's Eaton and began descending the bumpy little lane into the long valley where Cure Hardy lay. Mark was not, as a rule, very sensitive to beauty, but Jane, and his love for Jane, had already awakened him a little in this respect. Perhaps the winter morning sunlight affected him all the more so, because he had never been taught to regard it especially beautiful, and it therefore worked on his senses without interference. The earth and sky had the look of things recently washed. The brown fields looked as if they would be good to eat, and those in grass set off the curves of the little hills as close-clipped hairs set off the body of a horse. The sky looked further away than usual, but also clearer, so the long, slender streaks of cloud, dark slate color against the pale blue, had edges as clear as if they were cut out of cardboard. Every little copse was black and bristling as a hairbrush, and when the car stopped in Cure Hardy itself, the silence that followed, the turning off of the engine, was filled with the noise of rooks that seemed to be calling, "Wake, wake."
Bloody awful noise these birds make. Got your map? Now.
He plunged at once into business. They walked about the village for 2 hours and saw with their own eyes all the abuses and anachronisms they came to destroy. They saw the recalcitrant and backward laborer and heard his views on the weather. They met the wastefully supported pauper in the purse of an old man shuffling across the courtyard of the almshouses to fill a kettle, and the elderly rentier. To make matters worse, she had a fat old dog with her, in earnest conversation with the postman. It made Mark feel as if he were on a holiday, for it was only on holidays that he had ever wandered about an English village. For that reason he felt pleasure in it. It did not quite escape him that the face of the backward laborer was rather more interesting than Coaster's, and his voice a great deal more pleasing to the ear. The resemblance between the elderly rentier and Aunt Gilly, when had he last thought of her? Good Lord, that took one back. Did make him understand how it was possible to like that kind of person. All this did not in the least influence his sociological convictions. Even if he had been free from Bellbury and wholly unambitious, it could not have done so, for his education had had the curious effect of making things that he read and wrote more real to him than things he saw. Statistics about agricultural laborers were the substance. Any real ditcher, plowman, or farmer's boy was the shadow. Though he had never noticed it himself, he had a great reluctance in his work ever to use such words as man or woman. He preferred to write about vocational groups, elements, classes, and populations, for in his own way he believed as firmly as any mystic in the superior reality of the things that are not seen. And yet he could not help rather liking this village. When at 1 o'clock he persuaded Coster to turn into the Two Bells, he even said so. They had both brought sandwiches with them, but Mark felt he would like a pint of beer. In the Two Bells it was really warm and dark, for the window was small. 2 laborers, no doubt recalcitrant and backward, were sitting with earthenware mugs at their elbows, munching very thick sandwiches, and a third was standing up at the corner conducting a conversation with the landlord.
No beer for me, thanks. We don't want to muck about here for too long. What were you saying?
I was saying that on a fine morning there is something rather attractive about a place like this, in spite of all its obvious absurdities.
Yes, it is a fine morning. Makes a real difference to one's health, and a bit of sunlight.
I was thinking of the place.
You mean this? I should have thought it was just the sort of thing we wanted to get rid of. No sunlight, no ventilation. Haven't much use for alcohol myself, read the Miller report. But if people have got to have their stimulants, I'd like to see them administered in a more hygienic way.
I don't know that the stimulant is quite the whole point.
The whole scene was reminding him of drinks and talks long ago, of laughter and arguments in undergraduate days. Somehow one had made friends more easily then. He wondered what had become of all that set, of Carey and Wadston and Denniston, who had so nearly got his own fellowship.
Don't know, I'm sure,
said Koser in answer to his last remark.
Nutrition isn't my subject. You'd want to ask Stock about that.
What I'm really thinking about is not this pub, but the whole village. Of course, you're quite right, that sort of thing has got to go, but it had its pleasant side. We'll have to be careful that whatever we're building up in its place will really be able to beat it on all levels, not merely in efficiency.
Oh, architecture and all that. Well, that's hardly my line, you know. It's more for someone like Wither. Have you nearly finished?
All at once it came over Mark what a terrible bore this little man was, and in the same moment he felt utterly sick of the NICE. But he reminded himself that one could not expect to be in the interesting set at once. There would be better things later on. Anyway, he had not burnt his boats. Perhaps he would chuck up the whole thing and go back to Bracton in a day or two, but not at once. It would be only sensible to hang on for a bit and see how things shaped. On their way back, Coster dropped him near Edgedow Station, and as he walked home, Mark began to think of what he would say to Jane about Belbury. You will quite misunderstand him if you think he was consciously inventing a lie. Almost involuntarily, as the picture of himself entering the flat and of Jane's questioning face arose in his mind, there arose also the imagination of his own voice answering her, hitting off the salient features of Belbury in amusing and confident phrases. This imaginary speech of his own gradually drove out of his mind the real experiences he had undergone. Those real experiences of misgiving and of uneasiness indeed quickened his desire to cut a good figure in the eyes of his wife. Almost without noticing it, he had decided not to mention the affair of Keir Hardie. Jane cared for old buildings and all that sort of thing. As a result, when Jane, who was at that moment drawing the curtains, heard the door opening and looked round and saw Mark, she saw a rather breezy and buoyant Mark. Yes, he was almost sure he'd got the job. The salary wasn't absolutely fixed, but he'd be going into that tomorrow. It was a very funny place. He'd explain all that later. But he'd already got onto the real people there. Wither and Miss Hardcastle were the ones that mattered.
I must tell you about the Hardcastle woman. She's quite incredible.
Jane had to decide what she would say to Mark much more quickly than he had decided what he would say to her, and she decided to tell him nothing about the dreams or St. Anne's. Men hated women who had things wrong with them, especially queer, unusual things. Her resolution was easily kept, for Mark, full of his own story, asked her no questions. She was not perhaps entirely convinced by what he said. There was a vagueness about all the details. Very early in this conversation, she said in a sharp, frightened voice, she had no idea how he disliked that voice, "Mark, you haven't given up your fellowship at Bracton."
He assured her he had not, and went on.
She listened with only half her mind. She knew he often had rather grandiose ideas, and from something in his face she divined that during his absence he had been drinking much more than he usually did. And so all evening the male bird displayed his plumage, and the female played her part and asked questions and laughed, and feigned more interest than she felt. Both were young, and if neither loved very much, each was still anxious to be admired. That evening the fellows of Bracton sat in the common room over their wine and dessert. They had given up dressing for dinner as an economy during the war, and not yet resumed the practice, so that their sports coats and cardigans struck a somewhat discordant note against the dark Jacobean panels, the candlelight, and the silver of many different periods. Feverstone and Curry were sitting together. Until that night, for about 300 years, this common room had been one of the pleasant, quiet places of England. It was in Lady Alice, on the ground floor beneath the solar, and the windows at its eastern end looked out on the river and on Bragton Wood, across a little terrace where the fellows were in the habit of taking their dessert on summer evenings. At this hour and season, these windows were, of course, shut and curtained, and from beyond them came such noises as had never been heard in that room before, shouts and curses, and the sounds of lorries heavily drumming past, or harshly changing gear, rattling of chains, drumming of mechanical drills, clanging of iron, whistles, thudding, and, in all, perversive vibration.
Sueva sonare verbara, tum stridor feri tractaque catene.
As Glossop, sitting on the far side of the fire, had observed the jewel. For beyond those windows, scarcely 30 yards away on the other side of the wind, the conversion of an ancient woodland into an inferno of mud and noise and steel and concrete was already going on apace. Several members even of the progressive element, those who had rooms on this side of the college, had already been grumbling about it. Curry himself had been a little surprised by the form which his dream had taken, now that it was a reality, but he was doing his best to brazen it out, and through his conversation with Feverstone, had to be conducted at the top of their voices, he made no allusion to this inconvenience. "It's quite definite, then," he bawled. "The young Studek is not coming back?" "Quite! He sent a message through a high official to tell me to let the college know. When will he send a formal resignation?" "Haven't an earthly. Like all these youngsters, he's very casual about these things. Matter of fact, the longer he delays, the better." "You mean it gives us a chance to look about us?" "Quite. You see, nothing need come before the college till he writes. One wants to have the whole question of his successor taped before that. Obviously, that's most important. Once you present an open question to all these people who don't understand the field and don't know their own minds, you get anything happening." "Exactly. That's what we want to avoid. The only way to manage a place like this is to produce your own candidate. Bring the rabbit out of the hat 2 minutes after you've announced the vacancy. We must begin thinking about it at once. Does the successor have to be a sociologist? I mean, is the fellowship tied to the subject?" "Not in the least. It's one of those Paston fellowships. Why, had you a subject in mind?" "It's a long time since we had anyone in politics." Yes. There's still considerable prejudice against politics as an academic subject. I say, Feverstone, oughtn't we to give this new subject a leg up?" "What new subject?" "Pregnantometry." It's funny you should say that, because the man I was beginning to think of is a politician who has also been going in a good deal for pragmatometry. One could call it a fellowship in social pragmatometry, or something like that. "Who's the man?" "Laird, from Leicester, Cambridge." It was automatic for Curry to look very thoughtful, though he had never heard of Laird, and to say, "Ah, Laird, just remind me the details of his academic career." "Well, as you remember, he was in bad health at the time of his finals and came rather a cropper. Cambridge examining is so bad nowadays that one hardly counts that. Everyone knew he was one of the most brilliant men of his year. He was president of the Sphinxes and used to edit The Adult. David Laird, you know." "Yes, to be sure, David Laird. But I say, Dick." "Yes?" "Not quite happy about his bad degree. Of course, I don't attach a superstitious value to examination results any more than you do. Still, we've made 1 or 2 unfortunate elections lately." Almost involuntarily as he said this, Curry glanced across the room to where Pelham sat. Pelham, with his little button-like mouth and his pudding face. Pelham was a sound man, but even Curry found it difficult to remember anything that Pelham had ever done or said. "Yes, I know. But even our worst elections aren't quite so dim as those the college makes when we leave it to itself." Perhaps because the intolerable noise had frayed his nerves, Curry felt a momentary doubt about the dimness of these outsiders. He had dined recently at Northumberland, and found Telford dining there the same night. The contrast between the alert and witty Telford, whom everyone at Northumberland seemed to know, whom everyone listened to, and the dim Telford in Bragton Common Room, had perplexed him. Could it be that the silences of all these outsiders at his own college, their monosyllabic replies when he condescended, and their blank faces when he assumed his confidential manner, had an explanation which had never occurred to him? The fantastic suggestion that he, Curry, might be a bore, passed through his mind so swiftly that a second later he had forgotten it forever. The much less painful suggestion that these traditionalists and research beetles affected to look down on him was retained. But Feverstone was shouting at him again. "Going to a dinner at Cambridge next week," he said. "In fact, I'm giving a dinner. I'd as soon it wasn't mentioned here because, as a matter of fact, the PM might be coming and 1 or 2 big newspaper people and Tony Dew." "What?" "Of course you know Tony, the little dog man from the bank. Laird's gonna be there. He's some kind of cousin of the PM's. I was wondering if you could join us. I know David's very anxious to meet you. He's heard a lot about you from some chap who used to go to your lectures. Can't remember the name." Well, it would be very difficult. It rather depends on when old Bill's funeral is going to be. I should have to be here for that, of course. Was there anything about the inquest on the 6 o'clock news? Didn't hear! But of course that raises a second question. Now that Blizzard has gone to blow in a better world, we have 2 vacancies. I can't hear! Yelled Curry. Is the noise getting worse, or am I getting deaf? I say, Subwarden, shouted Brizaker from beyond Feverstone. What the devil have your friends doing outside? Can't they work without shouting? Asked someone else. Doesn't sound like work to me, said a third. Listen, said Glossop suddenly. That's not work. Listen to the feet. It's more like a game of rugger. It's getting worse every minute, said Rayner. Next moment, nearly everyone in the room was on his feet. What was that? Shouted one. Murdering someone, said Glossop. There's only one way of getting a noise like that out of a man's throat. Where are you going? Asked Curry. Going to see what's happening, said Glossop. Curry, go and collect all the shooters in college. Someone ring up the police. Shouldn't go if I were you, said Feverstone, who had remained seated and was pouring himself another glass of wine. Sounds as if the police or something were there already. What do you mean? Listen, there. Thought that was their infernal drill. Listen. My God, you really think it's a machine gun? Look out! Look out! Said a dozen voices at once as a splintering of glass became audible and a shower of stones fell onto the common room floor. A moment later, several of the fellows had made a rush for the windows and put up the shutters. And then they were all standing staring at one another, and silent but for the noise of heavy breathing. Glossop had a cut on his forehead, and on the floor lay the fragments of the famous east window, on which Henrietta Maria had once cut her name with a diamond. Who the hell is Henry Maria? Chapter 5. The next morning, Mark went back to Belbury by train. He had promised his wife to clear up a number of points about his salary and place of residence, and the memory of all these promises made a little cloud of uneasiness in his mind, but on the whole he was in good spirits. This return to Belbury, just sauntering in and hanging up his hat and ordering a drink, was a pleasant contrast to his first arrival. The servant who brought the drink knew him. Philostrato nodded to him. Women would fuss, but this was clearly the real world. After the drink he strolled upstairs to Coster's office. He was there for only 5 minutes, and when he came out, his state of mind had been completely altered. Steele and Coster were both there, and both looked up with the air of men who have been interrupted by a total stranger. Neither spoke.
Good morning.
Steele finished making a pencil note on some large document which was spread out before him.
What is it, Mr. Studdock?
He said without looking up.
I came to see Coster. I've just been thinking over the last section but one in that report. What report's this?
Oh, I thought it would be a good thing to put together a report on Cure Hardy in my spare time, and as there was nothing particular to do yesterday, I drew it up. Mr. Studdock helped me.
Never mind about that now. You can talk to Mr. Coster about it some other time, Mr. Studdock. I'm afraid he's busy at present. Look here, I think we'd better understand one another. Am I to take it that this report was simply a private hobby of Coster's? And if so, I should like to have known that before I spent 8 hours' work on it. And whose orders am I under?
Steele, playing with his pencil, looked at Coster.
I asked you a question about my position, Mr. Steele. I haven't time for this sort of thing. If you haven't any work to do, I have. I know nothing about your position.
Mark thought for a moment of turning to Coster, but Coster's smooth, freckled face and non-committal eyes suddenly filled him with such contempt that he turned on his heel and left the room, slamming the door behind him. He was going to see the deputy director. At the door of Wither's room, he hesitated for a moment because he heard voices from within, but he was too angry to wait. He knocked and entered without noticing whether the knock had been answered.
My dear boy, I'm delighted to see you.
The deputy director looked up, but didn't quite fix his eyes on Mark's face. As he heard these words, Mark noticed that there was a third person in the room. It was a man called Stone, whom he had met at dinner the day before. Stone was standing in front of Wither's table, rolling and unrolling a piece of blotting paper with his fingers. His mouth was open, his eyes fixed on the deputy director.
Delighted to see you. All the more so because you interrupted me in what I'm afraid I must call a rather painful interview. As I was just saying to poor Mr. Stone when you came in, nothing is nearer to my heart than the wish that this great institute should all work together like one family. The greatest unity of will and purpose, Mr. Stone, the freest mutual confidence, and that is what I expect of my colleagues. But then, as you may remind me, Mr. Studdock, even in family life there are occasionally strains and frictions and misgivings, and that is why, my dear boy, I'm not at the moment quite at leisure. Don't go, Mr. Stone. I have a great deal more to say to you.
Perhaps I'd better come back later.
Well, perhaps, in all circumstances, it is your feelings that I am considering, Mr. Stone. Perhaps the usual method of seeing me, Mr. Studdock, is to apply to my secretary and make an appointment. No, you will understand that I have the least wish to insist on any formalities, or would be other than pleased to see you whenever you looked in. It is the waste of your time that I am anxious to avoid.
Thank you, sir. I'll go and see your secretary.
The secretary's office was next door. When one went in, one found not the secretary himself, but a number of subordinates who were cut off from their visitors behind a sort of counter. Mark made an appointment for 10 o'clock tomorrow, which was the earliest hour they could offer him. As he came out, he ran into Fairy Hardcastle.
Hello, Studdock. Hanging around the DD's office? That won't do, you know. I have decided that I must either get my position definitely fixed once and for all, or else leave the Institute.
She looked at him with an ambiguous expression in which amusement seemed to predominate. Then she suddenly slipped her arm through his.
Look, Sonny, you drop all that C. It isn't going to do you any good. You come along and have a talk with me. There's really nothing to talk about, Miss Hardcastle. I'm quite clear in my mind. Either I get a real job here, or I go back to Bracton. That's simple enough. I don't even particularly mind which, so long as I know.
To this, the fairy made no answer, and the steady pressure of her arm compelled Mark, unless he was prepared to struggle, to go with her along the passage. The intimacy and authority of her grip was ludicrously ambiguous, and would have fitted almost equally well the relations of policeman and prisoner, mistress and lover, nurse and child. Mark felt he would look like a fool if they met anyone. She brought him to her own offices, which were on the second floor. The outer office was full of what he had already learned to call Wapes, the girl of the Women's Auxiliary Institutional Police. The men of the force, though very much more numerous, were not so often met with indoors, but Wapes were constantly seen flitting to and fro wherever Miss Hardcastle appeared. Far from sharing the masculine characteristics of their chief, they were, as Feverstone once said, feminine to the point of imbecility, small and slight and fluffy and full of giggles. Miss Hardcastle behaved toward them as if she were a man, and addressed them in tones of half-breezy, half-ferocious gallantry.
Cocktails, Dolly,
she bawled as they entered the outer office. When they reached the inner office, she made Mark sit down, but remained standing herself with her back to the fire and her legs wide apart. The drinks were brought, and Dolly retired, closing the door behind her. Mark had grumblingly told his grievance on the way.
Cut it all out, Studdock, and whatever you do, don't go bothering the DD. I told you before that you needn't worry about all those little third-floor people, provided you've got him on your side, which you have at present. But you won't have if you keep on going to him with complaints. That might be very good advice, Miss Hardcastle, if I were committed to staying here at all, but I'm not, and from what I've seen, I don't like the place. I very nearly made up my mind to go home, only I thought I'd just have a talk with him first, to make everything clear. Making things clear is the one thing the DD can't stand. That's not how he runs the place. And mind you, he knows what he's about. It works, Sonny. You've no idea yet how well it works. As for leaving, you're not superstitious, are you? I am. I don't think it's lucky to leave the NICE. You needn't bother your head about all the steals and cossers. That's part of your apprenticeship. You're being put through it at the moment, but if you hold on, you'll come out above them. All you've got to do is sit tight. Not one of them is going to be left when we get going. That's just the sort of line Cosser took about steel, and it didn't seem to do me much good when it came to the point. Do you know, Studdock, I've taken a fancy to you, and it's just as well I have. Because if I hadn't, I'd be disposed to resent that last remark. I don't mean to be offensive. But damn it all, look at it from my point of view. No good, Sonny. You don't know enough facts yet for your point of view to be worth sixpence. You haven't yet realized what you're in on. You're being offered a chance of something far bigger than a seat in the cabinet. And there are only two alternatives, you know. Either to be in the NICE or to be out of it. And I know better than you which is going to be the most fun. I do understand that. But anything is better than being nominally in and having nothing to do. Give me a real place in the sociological department and I'll...
Rats, that whole department is going to be scrapped. It had to be there at the beginning for propaganda purposes, but they're all going to be weeded out.
But what assurance have I that I'm going to be one of their successors?
You aren't. They're not going to have any successors. The real work has nothing to do with all these departments. The kind of sociology we're interested in will be done by my people, the police.
Then where do I come in?
If you'll trust me, I can put you on to a bit of your real work. What you were really brought here to do, straight away.
What's that?
Alcazan. You know who I'm talking about, don't you?
You mean the radiologist? The man who was guillotined?
He's to be rehabilitated. Gradually. I've got all the facts in the dossier. You began with a quiet little article, not questioning his guilt, not at first, but just hinting that, of course, he was a member of the Quisling government and there was prejudice against him. Say you don't doubt the verdict was just, but it's disquieting to realize that it would almost certainly have been the same even if he'd been innocent. Then you followed up in a day or two with an article of quite a different kind. Popular account of the value of his work. You can mug up the facts. Enough of that kind of article in an afternoon. Then a letter, rather indignant, to the paper that printed the first article. And going much further, the execution was a miscarriage of justice. By that time...
What on earth is the point of all this?
I'm telling you, Studdock. Alcazan is to be rehabilitated. Made into a martyr. An irreparable loss to the human race.
But what for?
There you go again. You grumble about being given nothing to do, and as soon as I suggest a bit of real work, you expect to have the whole plan of campaign told you before you do it. It doesn't make sense. That's not the way it's done here. The great thing is to do what you're told. If you turn out to be any good, you'll soon understand what's going on. But you've got to begin by doing the work. You don't seem to realize what we are. We're an army.
Anyway, I'm not a journalist. I didn't come here to write newspaper articles. I tried to make that clear to Feverstone at the very beginning.
The sooner you drop all that talk about what you came here to do, the better you'll get on. I'm speaking for your own good, Studdock. You can write. That's one of the things you're wanted for.
Then I've come here under a misunderstanding. I've no notion of spending my life writing newspaper articles, and if I had, I'd want to know a good deal more about the politics of the NICE before I went in for that sort of thing.
Haven't you been told that it's strictly non-political?
I've been told so many things that I don't know whether I'm on my head or my heels. But I don't see how one's going to start a newspaper stunt, which is about what this comes to, without being political. Is it left or right papers that are going to print all this rot about Alcazan?
Both, honey. Both. Don't you understand anything? Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and a fierce right, both on their toes and each terrified of the other? That's how we get things done. Any opposition to the NICE is represented as a left racket in the right papers, and a right racket in the left papers. If it's properly done, you get each side outbidding the other in support of us, to refute the enemy's slanders. Of course we're non-political. The real power always is.
I don't believe you can do that. Not with the papers that are read by educated people.
Much as you're still in the nursery, lovey. Haven't you yet realized that it's the other way around?
How do you mean?
Why, you fool, it's the educated readers who can be gold. All our difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results, and the little paragraphs about girls falling out of windows and corpses found in Mayfair flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. But the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything.
As one of the class you mentioned, I just don't believe it. Good Lord. Where are your eyes? Look at what the weeklies have got away with. Look at the weekly question. There's a paper for you. When Basic English came in simply as the invention of a free-thinking Cambridge Dawn, nothing was too good for it. As soon as it was taken up by a Tory Prime Minister, it became a menace to the purity of our language. And wasn't the monarchy an expensive absurdity for 10 years? And then, when the Duke of Windsor abdicated, didn't the question go all monarchist and legitimist for about a fortnight? Did they drop a single reader? Don't you see that the educated reader can't stop reading the highbrow weeklies, whatever they do? He can't. He's been conditioned. Well, this is all very interesting, Miss Hardcastle, but it has nothing to do with me. In the first place, I don't want to become a journalist at all. And if I did, I should like to be an honest journalist.
Very well. All you'll do is to help to ruin this country, and perhaps the whole human race, besides dishing your own career.
The confidential tone in which she had been speaking up till now disappeared, and there was a threatening finality in her voice. The citizen and the honest man, which had been awakened in Mark by the conversation, quailed a little. His other and far stronger self, the self that was anxious at all costs not to be placed among the outsiders, leaped up, fully alarmed.
I don't mean that I don't see your point. I was only wondering.
It's all one to me, Studdock. If you don't like the job, of course, that's your affair. Go and settle it with the DD. He doesn't like people resigning, but of course you can. He'll have something to say to Featherstone for bringing you here. We'd assumed you understood.
The mention of Feverstone brought sharply before Mark as a reality the plan, which had up till now been slightly unreal, of going back to Edgestow and satisfying himself with the career of a Fellow of Bracton. On what terms would he go back? Would he still be a member of the inner circle, even at Bracton? To find himself no longer in the confidence of the progressive element, to be thrust down among the Telfords and Jewels, seemed to him unendurable, and the salary of a mere Don looked a poor thing after the dreams he had been dreaming for the last few days. Married life was already turning out more expensive than he had reckoned. Then came a sharp doubt about that £200 for membership of the NICE club. But no, that was absurd. They couldn't possibly done him for that.
Well, obviously, the first thing is to see the DD.
Now that you're leaving, there's one thing I've got to say. I've laid all the cards on the table. If it should ever enter your head that it would be fun to repeat any of this conversation in the outer world, take my advice and don't. It wouldn't be at all healthy for your future career.
Oh, but of course.
You'd better run along now. Have a nice talk with the DD. Be careful not to annoy the old man. He does so hate resignations.
Mark made an attempt to prolong the interview, but the fairy did not permit this, and in a few moments he was outside the door. The rest of the day he passed miserably enough, keeping out of people's way as much as possible, lest his lack of occupation should be noticed. He went out before lunch for one of those short, unsatisfactory walks which a man takes in a strange neighborhood when he has brought with him neither old clothes nor a walking stick. After lunch he explored the grounds, but they were not the sort of grounds that anyone could walk in for pleasure. The Edwardian millionaire who had built Belbury had enclosed about 20 acres with a low brick wall surmounted by an iron railing, and laid it all out in what his contractor called ornamental pleasure grounds. There were trees dotted about and winding paths covered so thickly with round white pebbles that you could hardly walk on them. There were immense flower beds, some oblong, some lozenge-shaped, and some crescents. There were plantations, slabs would almost be a better word, of that kind of laurel which looks as if it were made of cleverly painted and varnished metal. Massive summer seats of bright green stood at regular intervals along the paths. The whole effect was like that of a municipal cemetery. Yet, unattractive as it was, he sought it again after tea, smoking though the wind blew the lit part down the side of his cigarette and his tongue was already burning. This time he wandered round to the back parts of the house where the newer and lower buildings joined it. Here he was surprised by a stable-like smell and a medley of growls, grunts, and whimpers. All the signs, in fact, of a considerable zoo. At first he did not understand, but presently he remembered that an immense program of vivisection, freed at last from red tape and from the niggling economy, was one of the plans of the NICE. He had not been particularly interested, and had thought vaguely of rats, rabbits, and an occasional dog. The confused noises from within suggested something very different. As he stood there, a loud, melancholy howl arose, and then, as if it had set the key, all manner of trumpetings, bayings, screams, laughter even, which shuddered and protested for a moment, and then died away into mutterings and whines. Mark had no scruples about vivisection. What the noise meant to him was the greatness and grandiosity of this whole undertaking from which, apparently, he was likely to be excluded. There were all sorts of things in there, thousands of pounds worth of living animality, which the Institute could afford to cut up like paper on the mere chance of some interesting discovery. He must get the job. He must somehow solve the problem of steel. But the noise was disagreeable, and he walked away. Mark woke next morning with the feeling that there would be certainly one, and perhaps two fences for him to get over during the day. The first was his interview with the deputy director. Unless he could get a very definite assurance about a post and a salary, he would certainly cut his connection with the Institute. And then when he reached home, the second fence would be his explanation to Jane of how the whole dream had faded away. The first real fog of the autumn had descended on Belbury that morning. Mark ate his breakfast by artificial light, and neither post nor newspaper had arrived. It was a Friday, and a servant handed him his bill for the portion of a week which he had already spent in the Institute. He put it in his pocket after a hasty glance, with the resolution that this, at any rate, should never be mentioned to Jane. Neither the total nor the items were of the sort that wives easily understand. He himself doubted whether there were not some mistake, but he was still at that age when a man would rather be fleeced to his last penny than dispute a bill. Then he finished his second cup of tea, felt for cigarettes, found none, and ordered a new packet. The odd half hour which he had waited before keeping his appointment with the deputy director passed slowly. No one spoke to him. Everyone else seemed to be hasting away on some important and well-defined purpose. For part of the time he was alone in the lounge and felt the servants looked at him as if he ought not to be there. He was glad when he was able to go upstairs and knock on Wither's door. He was admitted at once, but the conversation was not easy to begin because Wither said nothing, and though he looked up as soon as Mark entered, with an expression of dreamy courtesy, he did not look exactly at Mark, nor did he ask him to sit down. The room, as usual, was extremely hot, and Mark, divided by his desire to make it clear that he had fully resolved to be left hanging about no longer, and his equally keen desire not to lose the job if there were any job going, did not perhaps speak very well. At all events, the deputy director left him to run down, to pass into disjointed repetitions, and thence into complete silence. That silence lasted for some time. Wither sat with his lips pouted and slightly open as though he were humming a tune.
So I think, sir, I'd better go.
You are Mr. Studdock, I think.
Yes, I called on you with Lord Featherstone a few days ago. You gave me to understand that you were offering me a position on the sociological side of the NICE. But as I was saying...
One moment, Mr. Studdock. It is so important to be perfectly clear about what we are doing. You are no doubt aware that in certain senses of the words, it would be most unfortunate to speak of my offering anyone a post in the Institute. You must not imagine for a moment that I hold any kind of autocratic position, nor, on the other hand, that the relation between my own sphere of influence and the powers, I am speaking of their temporary powers, you understand, of the permanent committee or those of the director himself, are defined by any hard and fast system of what one might call a constitutional or even a constitutive character, for example.
Then, sir, can you tell me whether anyone has offered me a post? And, if so, who?
Oh, there has never been in the least question of that sort. I was always understood that your cooperation with the Institute would be entirely acceptable, would be of the greatest value.
Well, can I mean, oughtn't we to discuss the details? I mean, the salary, for example, and Who should I be working under?
My dear friend, I do not anticipate that there will be any difficulty about the financial side of the matter. As for...
What would the salary be, sir?
Well, there you touch on a point which it is hardly for me to decide. I believe that members in the position which we have envisaged you as occupying usually draw some sum like 1,500 a year, allowing for fluctuations calculated on a very liberal basis. You will find that all questions of that sort will adjust themselves with the greatest ease.
But when should I know, sir? Who ought I to go to about it?
You mustn't suppose, Mr. Studdock, that when I mention 1,500 I am at all excluding the possibility of some higher figure. I don't think any of us here would allow a disagreement on that point.
I should be perfectly satisfied with 1,500. I wasn't thinking of that at all. But... I suppose there'd be a contract or something of the kind.
Well, that is not exactly the sort of procedure. It would no doubt be possible.
And that isn't the main point, sir. There's the question of my status. Am I to work under Mr. Steele?
I have here a form, which has not, I believe, ever actually been used, but which was designed for such agreements. You might care to study it at your leisure, and if you are satisfied, we could sign it at any time.
But, about Mr. Steele...
Ah, the post at last. Perhaps, Mr. Studdock, you will have letters of your own to attend to. You are, I believe, married.
I'm sorry to delay you, sir, but about Mr. Steele, there is no good my looking at the form of agreement until that question is settled. I should feel compelled to refuse any position which involved working under Mr. Steele.
That opens up a very interesting question about which I should like to have a quite informal and confidential chat with you on some future occasion. For the moment, Mr. Studdock, I shall not regard anything you have said as final. If you care to call on me tomorrow...
He became absorbed in the letter he had opened, and Mark, feeling he had achieved enough for one interview, left the room. Apparently they did really want him at the NICE and were prepared to pay a high price for him. He would fight it out about Steele later. Meanwhile, he would study the form of agreement. He came downstairs again and found the following letter waiting for him.
Dear Mark, we were all sorry to hear from Dick that you're resigning your fellowship, but feel quite certain you've made the right decision as far as your own career is concerned. Once the NICE is settled in here, I shall expect to see almost as much of you as before. If you have not yet sent a formal resignation to NO, I shouldn't be in any hurry to do so. If you wrote early next term, the vacancy would come up at the February meeting, and we should have time to get a ready suitable candidate as your successor. Have you any ideas on the subject yourself? I'm talking to James and Dick the other night about David Laird. James hadn't heard of him before. No doubt you know his work. Could you let me have a line about it, and about his more general qualifications? I may see him next week when I'm running over to Cambridge to dine with the Prime Minister and one or two others. I think Dick might be induced to ask Laird as well. I've heard that we have a rather shindy here the other night. There was apparently some sort of fracas between the new workmen and the local inhabitants. The NICE police, who seemed to be a nervy lot, made the mistake of firing a few rounds over the head of the crowd. We had the Henrietta Maria window smashed, and several stones came into the common room. Glossop lost his head and wanted to go out and harangue the mob, but I managed to quiet him down. This is in strict confidence. There are lots of people ready to make capital out of it here and get a hue and cry against us for selling the wood. In haste, I must run off and make arrangements for Henry's funeral. Yours, G.C. Curry.
At the first words of this letter, a stab of fear ran through Mark. He tried to reassure himself. An explanation of the misunderstanding, which he would write and post immediately, would be bound to put everything right. They couldn't shove a man out of his fellowship simply on a chance word spoken by Lord Feverstone in the common room. It came back to him with miserable insight that what he was now calling a chance word was exactly what he had learned, in the progressive element, to describe as settling real business in private or cutting out the red tape. But he tried to thrust this out of his mind. It came back to him that poor Connington had actually lost his job in a way very similar to this, but he explained to himself that the circumstances had been quite different. Connington had been an outsider. He was inside, even more inside than Curry himself. But was he? If he were not inside at Belbury, and it began to look as if he were not, was he still in Feverstone's confidence? If he had to go back to Bracton, would he find that he retained even his old status there? Could he go back to Bracton? Yes, of course. He must write a letter at once explaining that he had not resigned and would not resign his fellowship. He sat down at a table in the writing room and took out his pen. Then another thought struck him. A letter to Curry, saying plainly that he meant to stay at Bracton, would be shown to Feverstone. Feverstone would tell Wither. Such a letter could be regarded as a refusal of any post at Belbury. Let it be. He would give up his short-lived dream and fall back on his fellowship. But how if that were impossible? The whole thing might have been arranged simply to let him fall between the two stools, kicked out of Belbury because he was retaining the Bracton fellowship, and kicked out of Bracton because he was supposed to be taking up a job at Belbury. Then he and Jane left to sink or swim, with not a cell between them, perhaps with Feverstone's influence against him when he tried to get another job. And where was Feverstone? Obviously, he must play his cards very carefully. He rang up the bell and ordered a large whiskey. At home, he would not have drunk till 12, and even then would have drunk only beer. But now, anyway, he felt curiously chilly. There was no point in catching a cold on top of all his other troubles. He decided that he must write a very careful and rather elusive letter. His first draft was, he thought, not vague enough. It could be used as proof that he had abandoned all idea of a job at Belbury. He must make it vaguer. But then, if it were too vague, it would do no good. Damn the whole thing! The £200 interest fee, the bill for his first week, and snatches of Imagine's attempts to make Jane see the whole episode in the proper light came coming between him and his task. In the end, with the aid of the whiskey and a great many cigarettes, he produced the following letter. The National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, Belbury, October 21st.
My dear Curry, Feverstone must have got me wrong. I never made the slightest suggestion of resigning my fellowship and don't in the least wish to do so. As a matter of fact, I have almost made up my mind not to take a full-time job with the NICE, and I hope to be back in college in a day or two. For one thing, I am rather worried about my wife's health, and don't like to commit myself to being much away at present. In the second place, though everyone here has been extremely flattering, and all press me to stay, the kind of job they want me for is more on the administrative and publicity side, and less scientific than I had expected. So be sure and contradict it if you hear anyone saying I am thinking of leaving Edgestowe. I hope you'll enjoy your jaunt to Cambridge. What circles you do move in. Yours, Mark G. Studdock. P.S. Laird wouldn't have done in any case. He got a third, and the only published work he's ventured on has been treated as a joke by serious reviewers. In particular, he has no critical faculty at all. You can always depend on him for admiring anything that is thoroughly bogus.
The relief of having finished the letter was only momentary, for almost as soon as he had sealed it, the problem of how to pass the rest of the day returned to him. He decided to go and sit in his own room, but when he went up there he found the bed stripped and a vacuum cleaner in the middle of the floor. Apparently members were not expected to be in their bedrooms at this time of day. He came down and tried the lounge. The servants were tidying it. He looked into the library. It was empty, but for two men who were talking with their heads close together. They stopped and looked up as soon as he entered, obviously waiting for him to go. He pretended he had come to get a book and retired. In the hall he saw Steele himself standing by the notice board and talking to a man with a pointed beard. Neither looked at Mark, but as he passed them they became silent. He dawdled across the hall and pretended to examine the barometer. Wherever he went he heard doors opening and shutting, the tread of rapid feet, occasional ringing of telephones, all the signs of a busy institution carrying on a vigorous life from which he was excluded. He opened the front door and looked out. The fog was thick, wet, and cold. There is one sense in which every narrative is false. It dare not attempt, even if it could, to express the actual movement of time. The day was so long to Mark that a faithful account of it would be unreadable. Sometimes he sat upstairs, for at last they finished doing his bedroom. Sometimes he went out into the fog, sometimes he hung about the public rooms. Every now and then these would be unaccountably filled up by crowds of talking people, and for a few minutes the strain of trying not to look unoccupied, not to seem miserable and embarrassed, would be imposed on him, and suddenly, as if summoned by their next engagement, all these people would hurry away. Sometime after lunch he met Stone in one of the passages. Mark had not thought of him since yesterday morning, but now, looking at the expression on his face and something furtive in his whole manner, he realized that here, at any rate, was someone who felt as uncomfortable as himself. Stone had the look which Mark had often seen before in unpopular boys or new boys at school, in outsiders at Bracton, that look which was for Mark the symbol of all his worst fears. For to be one who must wear that look was, in his scale of values, the greatest evil. His instinct was not to speak to this man Stone. He knew by experience how dangerous it is to be friends with a sinking man, or even to be seen with him. You cannot keep him afloat, and he may pull you under. But his own craving for companionship was now acute, so that against his better judgment he smiled a sickly smile and said,
Hello.
Stone gave a start as if to be spoken to were almost a frightening experience.
Good afternoon.
Let's come and talk somewhere if you're not busy.
I am. That is to say, I'm not sure how long I'll be free.
Tell me about this place. It seems to me perfectly bloody, but I haven't yet made up my mind. Come to my room.
I don't think that at all. Not at all. Who said I thought that?
Answered Stone very quickly. And Mark did not answer because at that moment he saw the deputy director approaching them. He was to discover during the next few weeks that no passage and no public room at Belbury was ever safe from the prolonged indoor walks of the deputy director. They could not be regarded as a form of espionage, for the creak of Wither's boots and the dreary little tune which he was nearly always humming would have defeated any such purpose. One heard him quite a long way off. Often one saw him a long way off as well, for he was a tall man. Without his stoop he would have been very tall indeed. And often, even in a crowd, one saw that face at a distance staring vaguely toward you. But this was Mark's first experience of that ubiquity, and he felt the DD could not have appeared at a more unfortunate moment. Very slowly he came towards them, looked in their direction, though it was not plain from his face whether he recognized them or not, and passed on. Neither of the young men attempted to resume their conversation. At tea, Mark saw Feverstone and went at once to sit beside him. He knew the worst thing a man in his position could do was to try to force himself on anyone, but he was now feeling desperate.
I say, Feverstone, I'm in search of information. Yes, I haven't had exactly what you'd call a glowing reception from Steele. But the DD won't hear of my leaving, and the Fairy seems to want me to write newspaper articles? What the hell am I supposed to be doing? Because I'm damned if I can find out. I've tried to tackle the old boy direct.
God!
Can one never get anything out of him?
Not what you want.
Well, how the devil is one to find out what's wanted if nobody offers any information?
Quite.
Oh, and by the way, that reminds me of something else. How on earth did Curry get hold of the idea that I'm resigning my fellowship?
Aren't you?
I never had the faintest notion of resigning it.
Really? I was told distinctly by the Fairy that you weren't coming back.
You don't suppose I'd do it through her if I was going to resign?
It doesn't make me any odds, you know. The NICE wants you to have a nominal job somewhere outside Belbury. You'll have one. If they don't, you won't. Just like that.
Damn the NICE. I'm merely trying to retain the fellowship I already had, which is no concern of theirs. One doesn't want to fall between two stools.
One doesn't want to.
You mean...
Take my advice. Get into Wither's good books again as soon as you can. I gave you a good start, but you seem to have rubbed him the wrong way. His attitude has changed since this morning. You need to humor him, you know, and just between ourselves, wouldn't be too thick with the Fairy. Won't do you any good higher up. There are wheels within wheels.
In the meantime, I've written to Curry to explain that it's all rot about my resignation.
No harm if it amuses you.
Well, I don't suppose college wants to kick me out simply because Curry misunderstood something Miss Hardcastle said to you.
You can't be deprived of a fellowship under any statute I know, except for gross immorality.
No, of course not. I didn't mean that. I meant not being re-elected when I come up for re-election next term.
Oh, I see.
And that's why I must rely on you to get that idea out of Curry's head. You will be sure to make it quite clear to him that the whole thing was a misunderstanding.
Don't you know Curry? You'll have got this whole wangling machine going on the problem of your successor long ago.
That's why I am relying on you to stop him.
Me?
Yes?
Why me?
Well, damn it all, Feverstone, it was you who first put the idea into his head.
Do you know? I find your style of conversation rather difficult. You come up for re-election in a few months. College may decide to re-elect you, or of course it may not. As far as I can make out, you're at present attempting to canvass my vote in advance. To which the proper answer is the one I now give. Go to hell!
You know perfectly well that there was no doubt about my re-election until you spoke a word in Curry's ear.
Feverstone helped himself to a muffin and eyed it critically.
You make me rather tired. If you don't know how to steer your own course in a place like Bracton, why come and pester me? I'm not a fucking nurse. For your own good, I would advise you, in talking to people here, to adopt a more agreeable manner than you're using now. Otherwise your life may be, in the famous words, nasty, poor, brutish, and short.
Short? Is that a threat? Do you mean my life at Bracton or at the NICE?
Shouldn't stress the distinction too much if I were you.
I shall remember that. It was you who brought me here. I thought you at least were my friend.
Incurable romantic!
Said Lord Feverstone, deftly extending his mouth to an even wider grin and popping the muffin into it entire. And thus Mark knew that if he lost the Belbury job, he would lose his fellowship at Bracton as well. During these days, Jane spent as little time as possible in the flat and kept herself awake reading in bed as long as she could each night. Sleep had become her enemy. In the daytime, she kept on going to Edgestow, nominally in the attempt to find another woman who could come in twice a week instead of Mrs. Maggs. On one of these occasions, she was delighted to find herself suddenly addressed by Camilla Denniston. Camilla had just stepped out of a car, and next moment she introduced a tall, dark man as her husband. Jane saw at once that both the Dennistons were the sort of people she liked. She knew that Mr. Denniston had once been a friend of Mark's, but she had never met him. And her first thought was to wonder, as she had wondered before, why Mark's present friends were so inferior to those he had once had. Carey and Wadston and the Taylors, who had all been members of the set in which she first got to know him, had been nicer than Curry and Busby, not to mention the Feverstone man, and this Mr. Denniston was obviously very much nicer indeed.
We were just coming to see you. Look here, we have lunch with us. Let's drive you up to the woods beyond Sandown and all feed together in the car. There's lots to talk about.
Or what about your coming to the flat and lunching with me? It's hardly a day for picnicking.
That only means extra washing up for you. Had we better go somewhere in town, Arthur? If Mrs. Studdock thinks it's too cold and foggy.
A restaurant would hardly do, Mrs. Studdock. We want to be private. As well, don't you like a rather foggy day in a wood in autumn? You'll find we shall be perfectly warm sitting in the car.
Jane said she'd never heard of anyone liking fogs before, but she didn't mind trying. All three got in.
That's why Camilla and I got married. We both like weather. Not this or that kind of weather, but just weather. It's a useful taste to have if one lives in England.
How ever did you learn to do that, Mr. Dennison? I don't think I should ever learn to like rain and snow.
It's the other way round. Everyone begins as a child by liking weather. You learn the art of disliking it as you grow up. Haven't you ever noticed it on a snowy day? The grown-ups are all going about with long faces, but look at the children and the dogs. They know what snow is made for.
I'm sure I hated wet days as a child.
And that's because the grown-ups kept you in. Any child loves rain if it's allowed to go out and paddle about in it.
Presently they left the unfenced road beyond Sandon, and went bumping across grass and among trees, and finally came to rest in a sort of grassy bay area, with a fir thicket on one side and a group of beeches on the other. There were wet cobwebs and a rich autumnal smell all around them. Then all three sat together in the back of the car, and there was some unstrapping of baskets, and then sandwiches and a little flask of sherry, and finally hot coffee and cigarettes. Jane was beginning to enjoy herself.
Now.
Well, I suppose we'd better begin. You know, of course, where we're from, Miss Studdock.
From Miss Ironwood's?
Well, from the same house, but we don't belong to Grace Ironwood. She and we both belong to someone else.
Yes?
Our little household, our company, our society, whatever you like to call it, is run by a Mr. Fisher King. At least that is the name he has recently taken. You might or might not know his original name if it was told to you. He's a great traveler, but now an invalid. Got a wound in his foot on his last journey which won't heal.
How did he come to change his name?
Had a married sister in India, a Miss Fisher King. She has just died and left him a large fortune on the condition that he took the name. She was a remarkable woman in her way, a friend of the great native Christian mystic whom you may have heard of, the Surah. And that's the point. The Surah had reason to believe, or thought he had reason to believe, that a great danger was hanging over the whole human race. Just before the end, just before he disappeared, he became convinced that it would actually come to a head in this island. And after he'd gone...
Is he dead?
That we don't know. Some people think he's alive, others not. At any rate, he's disappeared.
and Miss Fisher-King more or less handed the problem over to her brother, to our chief. That, in fact, was why she gave him the money. He was to collect a company round him to watch for this danger, and to strike when it came.
That's not quite right, Arthur. He was told that a company would in fact collect round him, and he was to be its head.
I didn't think we need go into that, but I agree. And now, Miss Studdock, this is where you come in. The Surah said that when the time came, we should find what he called a seer, a person with second sight.
Not that we'd get a seer, Arthur. That a seer would turn up. Either we or the other side would get her.
And it looks as if you were the seer. Please, I don't want to be anything so exciting. No, it's rough luck on you.
I gathered from Grace Ironwood that you weren't quite convinced you were a seer. I mean, you thought it might be just ordinary dreams. Do you still think that?
It's all so strange and beastly.
She liked these people, but her habitual inner prompter was whispering,
Take care. Don't get drawn in. Don't commit yourself to anything. You've got your own life to live.
Then impulsive honesty forced her to add,
As a matter of fact, I've had another dream since then, and it turns out to have been true. I saw the murder, Mr. Hengist's murder.
There you are. Oh, Mrs. Studdock, you must come in. You must. You must. That means we're right on top of it now. Don't you see? We've been wondering all this time exactly where the trouble is going to begin, and now your dream gives us a clue. You've seen something within a few miles of Edgestow. In fact, we are apparently in the thick of it already, whatever it is, and we can't move an inch without your help. You are our secret service, our eyes. It's all been arranged long before we were born. Don't spoil everything. Do join us.
No, Cam, don't. The Pendragon, the head, I mean, he wouldn't like us to do it like that. Miss Studdock must come in freely. But I don't know anything about all this, do I? I don't want to take sides in something I don't understand.
But don't you see that you can't be neutral? If you don't give yourself to us, the enemy will use you.
The words, give yourself to us, were ill-chosen. The very muscles of Jane's body stiffened a little. If the speaker had been anyone who attracted her less than Camilla, she would have become like stone to any further appeal. Denniston laid a hand on his wife's arm.
You must see from Miss Studdock's point of view, dear. You forget she knows practically nothing at all about us, and that is the real difficulty. We can't tell her much until she's joined. We are in fact asking her to take a leap in the dark. It is like that. Like getting married, going into the Navy as a boy, or becoming a monk, trying a new thing to eat. You can't know what it's like until you take the plunge. In that case, it's rather difficult to see why one should take it at all. I admit frankly that you can only take it on trust. It all depends, really, I suppose, what impression the Dimbles and Grace and we two have made on you. And, of course, the head himself, when you meet him. What exactly are you asking me to do? To come and see our chief, first of all, and then, well, to join. It would involve making certain promises to him. He is really the head, you see. We've all agreed to take his orders. Oh, there's one other thing. What view would Mark take about it? He and I are old friends, you know.
I wonder, need we go into that for the moment?
It's bound to come up sooner or later. Mark? How does he come into it? I can't imagine what he'd say about all this. He'd probably think we're all off our heads. Would he object, though? I mean, would he object to your joining us? If he were at home, I suppose he'd be rather surprised if I announced I was going to stay indefinitely at St. Anne's. Does joining you mean that? Isn't Mark at home? No. He's at Belbury. I think he's going to have a job in the NICE.
She was rather pleased to be able to say this, for she was well aware of the distinction it implied. If Denniston was impressed, he did not show it.
I don't think that joining us would mean, at the moment, coming to live at St. Anne's, especially in the case of a married woman, unless old Mark got really interested and came himself. That's quite out of the question. He doesn't know Mark.
She thought.
Anyway, that is hardly the real point at the moment. Would he object to your joining, putting yourself under the head's orders and making the promises and all that? Would he object? What on earth would it have to do with him? Well, the head, or the authorities he obeys, have rather old-fashioned notions. He wouldn't like a married woman to come in, if it could be avoided, without her husband's, without consulting. You mean I'm to ask Mark's permission?
The resentment, which had been rising and ebbing, but rising each time a little more than it ebbed, for several minutes, had now overflowed. All this talk of promises and obedience to an unknown Mr. Fisher King had already repelled her, but the idea of this same person sending her back to get Mark's permission, as if she were a child asking leave to go on a party, was the climax. For a moment she looked on Mr. Denniston with real dislike. She saw him and Mark and the Fisher King man and this preposterous Indian fakir simply as men, complacent, patriarchal figures making arrangements for women as if women were children or bartering them like cattle.
And so the king promised that if anyone killed the dragon, he would give him his daughter in marriage.
The words flashed through her mind, and she felt very angry.
Arthur, I see a light over there. Do you think it's a bonfire?
Yes, I should say it was.
My feet are getting cold. Let's go for a little walk and look at the fire. I wish we had some chestnuts.
Oh, do let's.
They got out. It was warmer in the open than it had by now become in the car, warm and full of leafy smells and dampness and the small noise of dripping branches. The fire was big and in its middle life, a smoking hillside of leaves on one side and great caves and cliffs of glowing red on the other. They stood round it and chatted of indifferent matters for a time.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I won't join your whatever it is, but I'll promise to let you know if I have any more dreams of that sort. That is splendid, and I think it is as much as we have any right to expect. I quite see your point of view. May I ask for one more promise? What is that? Not to mention us to anyone. Oh, certainly.
Later, when they had returned to the car and were driving back, Mr. Denniston said,
I hope the dreams will not worry you much now, Miss Studdock. No, I don't mean I hope they'll stop, and I don't think they will either. But now that you know they are not something in yourself, but only things going on in the outer world, nasty things no doubt, but no worse than lots you read in the papers, I believe you'll find them quite bearable. The less you think of them as your dreams, and the more you think of them, well, as news, the better you'll feel about them.
Chapter 6. A night, with little sleep, and half another day dragged past before Mark was able to see the deputy director again. He went to him in a chastened frame of mind, anxious to get the job on almost any terms.
I have brought back the form, sir.
What form?
Mark found he was talking to a new and different Wither. The absent-mindedness was still there, but the courtliness was gone. The man looked at him as if out of a dream, as if divided from him by an immense distance, but with a sort of dreamy distaste which might turn into active hatred if ever that distance were diminished. He still smiled, but there was something cat-like in the smile, an occasional alteration of the lines about the mouth which even hinted at a snarl. Mark, in his hands, was a mouse. At Bracton, the progressive element, having to face only scholars, had passed for very knowing fellows, but here at Belbury one felt quite different. Wither said he had understood that Mark had already refused the job. He could not, in any event, renew the offer. He spoke vaguely and alarmingly of strains and frictions, of injurious behavior, of the danger of making enemies, of the impossibility that the NICE could harbor a person who appeared to have quarreled with all its members in the first week. He spoke even more vaguely and alarmingly of conversations he had had with your colleagues at Bracton, which entirely confirmed this view. He doubted if Mark were really suited to a learned career, but disclaimed any intention of giving advice. Only after he had hinted and murmured Mark into a sufficient state of dejection did he throw him, like a bone to a dog, the suggestion of an appointment for a probationary period at roughly, he could not commit the Institute, 600 a year, and Mark took it. He attempted to get answers even then to some of his questions. From whom was he to take orders? Was he to reside at Belbury?
I think, Mr. Studdock, we have already mentioned elasticity as the keynote of the Institute. Unless you were prepared to treat membership as a vocation rather than a mere appointment, I could not conscientiously advise you to come to us. There are no watertight compartments. I believe I could not persuade the committee to invent for your benefit some cut-and-dried position in which you would discharge artificially limited duties, and apart from these, regard your time as your own. Pray allow me to finish, Mr. Studdock. We are, as I have said before, more like a family, or even perhaps like a single personality. There must be no question of taking your orders, as you rather unfortunately suggest, from some specified official, and considering yourself free to adopt an intransigent attitude to your other colleagues. I must ask you not to interrupt me, please. That is not the spirit in which I would wish you to approach your duties. You must make yourself useful, Mr. Studdock, generally useful. I do not think the Institute could allow anyone to remain in it who showed a disposition to stand on his rights, who grudged this or that piece of service because it fell outside some function which he had chosen to circumscribe by a rigid definition. On the other hand, it would be quite equally disastrous, I mean for yourself, Mr. Studdock, I am thinking throughout of your own interests, quite equally disastrous if you allowed yourself ever to be distracted from your real work by unauthorized collaboration, or worse still, interference with the work of other members. Do not let casual suggestions distract you or dissipate your energies. Concentration, Mr. Studdock, concentration, and the free spirit of give and take. If you avoid both the errors I have mentioned, then, I do not think I need despair of correcting on your behalf certain unfortunate impressions which, we must admit, your behavior has already produced. No, Mr. Studdock, I can allow no further discussion. My time is already fully occupied. I cannot be continually harassed by conversations of this sort. You must find your own level, Mr. Studdock. Good morning, Mr. Studdock, good morning. Remember what I have said. I am trying to do all I can for you. Good morning.
Mark reimbursed himself for the humiliation of this interview by reflecting that if he were not a married man, he would not have borne it for a moment. This seemed to him, though he did not put it into words, to throw the burden upon Jane. It also set him free to think of all the things he would have said to Wither if he hadn't had Jane to bother about, and would still say, if ever he got the chance. This kept him in a sort of twilight happiness for several minutes, and when he went to tea he found that the reward for his submission had already begun. The fairy signed to him to come and sit beside her.
You haven't done anything about Alcazend yet? No, because I hadn't really decided to stay, not until this morning. I could come up and look at your materials this afternoon, at least as far as I know, for I haven't yet really found out what I'm supposed to be doing. Elasticity, Sonny. Elasticity. You never will. Your line is to do whatever you're told, and above all, not to bother the old man.
During the next few days, several processes, which afterward came to seem important, were steadily going on. The fog, which covered Edgestow as well as Belbury, continued and grew denser. At Edgestow one regarded it as coming up from the river, but in reality it lay all over the heart of England. It blanketed the whole town so that walls dripped and you could write your name in the dampness on tables, and men worked by artificial light at midday. The workings, where Bragdon Wood had been, ceased to offend conservative eyes and became mere clangings, thuddings, hootings, shouts, curses, and metallic screams in an invisible world. Some felt glad that the obscenity should thus be covered, for all beyond the wind was now an abomination. The grip of the NICE on Edgestow was tightening. The river itself, which had once been brownish-green and amber and smooth-skinned silver, tugging at the reeds and playing with the red roots, now flowed opaque, thick with mud, sailed on by endless fleets of empty tins, sheets of paper, cigarette ends, and fragments of wood, sometimes varied by rainbow patches of oil. Then the invasion actually crossed it. The Institute had bought the land up to the left or eastern bank, but now Busby was summoned to meet Feverstone and a Professor Frost as the representatives of the NICE, and learned for the first time that the wind itself was to be diverted. There was to be no river in Edgestow. This was still strictly confidential, but the Institute had already powers to force it. This being so, a new adjustment of boundaries between it and the college was clearly needed. Busby's jaw fell when he realized the Institute wanted to come right up to the college walls. He refused, of course, and it was then that he first heard a hint of requisitioning. The college could sell today, and the Institute offered a good price. If they did not, compulsion and a merely nominal compensation awaited them. Relations between Feverstone and the bursar deteriorated during the interview. An extraordinary college meeting had to be summoned, and Busby had to put the best face he could on things to his colleagues. He was almost physically shocked by the storm of hatred which met him. In vain did he point out that those who were now abusing him had themselves voted for the sale of the wood, but equally in vain did they abuse him.
The college was caught in a net of necessity.
They sold the little strip on their side of the wind, which meant so much. It was no more than a terrace between the eastern walls and the water. 24 hours later, the NICE boarded over the doomed wind and converted the terrace into a dump. All day long, workmen were trampling across the planks with heavy loads, which they flung down against the very walls of Bracton, till the pile had covered the boarded blindness which had once been the Henrietta Maria window, and reached almost to the east window of the chapel. In these days, many members of the progressive element dropped off and joined the opposition. Those who were left were hammered closer together by this unpopularity they had to face, and though the college was thus sharply divided within, yet for the very same reason, it also took on a new unity perforce in its relations to the outer world. Bracton, as a whole, bore the blame for bringing the NICE to Edgestow at all. This was unfair, for many high authorities in the university had thoroughly approved Bracton's action in doing so, but now that the result was becoming apparent, people refused to remember this. Busby, though he had heard the hint of requisitioning in confidence, lost no time in spreading it through Edgestow common rooms. "It would have done no good if we had refused to sell," he said. But nobody believed that this was why Bracton had sold, and the unpopularity of that college steadily increased. The undergraduates got wind of it and stopped attending the lectures of Bracton Dons. Busby and even the wholly innocent warden were mobbed in the streets. The town, which did not usually share the opinions of the university, was almost in an unsettled condition. The disturbance in which the Bracton windows had been broken was taken little notice of in the London papers or even in the Edgestow Telegraph, but it was followed by other episodes. There was an indecent assault in one of the mean streets down by the station. There were 2 beatings up in a public house. There were increasing complaints of threatening and disorderly behavior on the part of the NICE workmen. But these complaints never appeared in the papers. Those who had actually seen ugly incidents were surprised to read in the Telegraph that the new institute was settling down very comfortably in Edgestow and the most cordial relations developing between it and the natives. Those who had not seen them but only heard of them, finding nothing in the Telegraph, dismissed the stories as rumors or exaggeration. Those who had seen them wrote letters of it, but it did not print their letters. But if episodes could be doubted, no one could doubt that nearly all the hotels of the town had passed into the hands of the Institute, so that a man could no longer drink with a friend in his accustomed bar, that familiar shops were crowded with strangers who seemed to have plenty of money, and that prices were higher, that there was a queue for every omnibus and a difficulty in getting into every cinema. Quiet houses that had looked out on quiet streets were now shaken all day long by heavy and unaccustomed traffic. Wherever one went, one was jostled by crowds of strangers. To a little midland market town like Edgestow, even visitors from the other side of the country had hitherto ranked as aliens. The day-long clamor of northern Welsh and even Irish voices, the shouts, the catcalls, the songs, and wild faces passing in the fog were utterly detestable. "It's going to be trouble here," was the comment of many a citizen, and in a few days, "You'd think they wanted trouble." It's not recorded who first said, "We need more police," and then at last the Edgestow Telegraph took notice. A shy little article, a cloud no bigger than a man's hand, appeared suggesting that the local police were quite incapable of dealing with the new population. Of all these things Jane took little notice. She was, during these days, merely hanging on. Perhaps Mark would summon her to Belbury. Perhaps he would give up the whole Belbury scheme and come home. His letters were vague and unsatisfactory. Perhaps she would go out to St. Anne's and see the Denistons. The dreams continued. But Mr. Deniston had been right. It was better when one had given in to regarding them as news. If it had not been, she could hardly have endured her nights. There was one recurrent dream in which nothing exactly happened. She seemed indeed to be lying in her own bed, but there was someone beside the bed, someone who had apparently drawn a chair up to the bedside and then sat down to watch. He had a notebook in which he occasionally made an entry. Otherwise he sat perfectly still and patiently attentive, like a doctor. She knew his face already, and came to know it infinitely well, the pince-nez, the well-chiseled, rather white features, and the little pointed beard. And presumably, if he could see her, he must by now know hers equally well. It was certainly herself whom he appeared to be studying. Jane did not write about this to the Denistons the first time it occurred. Even after the second, she delayed until it was too late to post the letter that day. She had a sort of hope that the longer she kept silent, the more likely they would be to come and see her again. She wanted comfort, but she wanted it, if possible, without going out to St. Anne's, without meeting this Fisher King man and getting drawn into his orbit. Mark, meanwhile, was working at the rehabilitation of Alcazan. He had never seen a police dossier before and found it difficult to understand. In spite of his efforts to conceal his ignorance, the fairy soon discovered it.
I'll put you under the captain. He'll show you the ropes.
That was how Mark came to spend most of his working hours with her second-in-command, Captain O'Hara, a big white-haired man with a handsome face, talking in what English people call the southern brogue, and Irish people a Dublin accent you could cut with a knife. He claimed to be of ancient family and had a seat at Castlemortal. Mark did not really understand his explanations of the dossier, the queue register, the sliding file system, and what the captain called weeding. But he was ashamed to confess this, and so it came about that the whole selection of facts really remained in O'Hara's hands, and Mark found himself working merely as a writer. He did his best to conceal this from O'Hara and to make it appear that they were really working together. This naturally made it impossible for him to repeat his original protests against being treated as a mere journalist. He had indeed a taking style, which had helped his academic career much more than he would have liked to acknowledge, and his journalism was a success. His articles and letters about Alcazan appeared in papers where he would never have had the entree over his own signatures, papers read by millions. He could not help feeling a little thrill of pleasurable excitement. He also confided to Captain O'Hara his minor financial anxieties. When was one paid? And in the meantime he was short of petty cash. He had lost his wallet on the very first night at Belbury, and it had never been recovered. O'Hara roared with laughter.
Sure, you can have any money you like by asking the steward.
You mean it's then deducted from one's next check?
Man, once you're in the Institute, God bless it, you needn't bother your head about that. Aren't we going to take over the whole currency system? It's we that make money.
Do you mean... But they'd come down on you for the lot if you left.
What do you want to be talking about leaving at all? No one leaves the Institute. At least, the only one I ever heard of was old Hengist.
About this time, Hengist's inquest came to an end with a verdict of murder by a person or persons unknown. The funeral service was held in the college chapel at Bracton. It was the third and thickest day of the fog, which was now so dense and white that men's eyes smarted from looking at it, and all distant sounds were annihilated. Only the drip from eaves and trees and the shouts of the workmen outside chapel were audible within the college. Inside the chapel, the candles burned with straight flames, each flame the center of a globe of greasy luminosity, and cast almost no light on the building as a whole. But for the coughing and shuffling of feet, one could not have known that the stalls were quite full. Curry, black-suited and black-gowned and looming unnaturally large, went to and fro at the western end of the chapel, whispering and peering, anxious lest the fog might delay the arrival of what he called the remains, and not unpleasingly conscious of the weight wherewith the responsibility of the whole ceremony pressed upon his shoulders. Curry was very great at college funerals. There was no taint of the undertaker about him. He was the restrained, manly friend, stricken by a heavy blow, but still mindful that he was, in some undefined sense, the father of the college, and that amid all the spoils of mutability he, at any rate, must not give way. Strangers who had been present on such occasions often said to one another as they drove off, "You could see the subwarden chap really felt it, even though he wasn't going to show it." There was no hypocrisy in this. Curry was so used to superintending the lives of his colleagues that it came naturally to him to superintend their deaths, and possibly, if he had possessed an analytic mind, he might have discovered in himself a vague feeling that his influence, his powers of smoothing paths and pulling suitable wires, could not really quite cease once the breath was out of the body. The organ began to play and drown both the coughing within and the harsher noises without, the monotonously ill-tempered voices, the rattle of iron, and the vibrating shocks with which loads were flung from time to time against the chapel wall. But the fog had, as Curry feared, delayed the coffin, and the organist had been playing for half an hour before there came a stir about the door, and the family mourners, the black-clad Hengists of both sexes with their ramrod backs and country faces, began to be ushered into the stalls reserved for them. Then came maces and beadles and censers and the Grand Rector of Edgestow, then singing, the choir, and finally the coffin, an island of flowers drifting indistinctly through the fog, which seemed to have poured in, thicker, colder, and wetter with the opening of the door. The service began. Canon Story took it. His voice was still beautiful, and there was beauty, too, in his isolation from all that company. He was isolated both by his faith and his deafness. He felt no qualm about the appropriateness of the words which he read over the corpse of the proud old unbeliever, for he had never suspected his unbelief, and he was wholly unconscious of the strange antiphony between his own voice reading and the other voices from without. Glossop might wince when one of those voices, impossible to ignore in the silence of the chapel, was heard shouting, "Take your fucking great foot out of the light, or I'll let you have the whole lot on top of it!" But Story, unmoved and unaware, replied, "Thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened unless it die." "I'll give you one across your ugly face in a moment, see if I don't!" "It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body." "Disgraceful, disgraceful," muttered Curry to the bursar who sat next to him. But some of the junior fellows saw, as they said, the funny side of it, and thought how Feverstone, who had been unable to be present, would enjoy the story. The pleasantest of the rewards which fell to Mark for his obedience was admission to the library. Shortly after his brief intrusion into it on that miserable morning, he had discovered that this room, though nominally public, was in practice reserved for what one had learned at school to call bloods, and at Bracton, the progressive elements. It was on the library hearthrug, and during the hours between 10 and midnight, that the important and confidential talks took place, and that was why, when Feverstone one evening sidled up to Mark in the lounge and said,
What about a drink in the library?
Mark smiled, and agreed, and harbored no resentment for the last conversation he had had with Feverstone. If he felt a little contempt of himself for doing so, he repressed and forgot it. That sort of thing was childish and unrealistic. The circle in the library usually consisted of Feverstone, the fairy, Philostrato, and, more surprisingly, Reverend Strake. It was balm to Mark's wounds to find that Steele never appeared there. He had apparently got in beyond or behind Steele, as they had promised him he would. All was working according to program. The one person whose frequent appearance in the library he did not understand was the silent man with the pince-nez and the pointed beard, Professor Frost. The deputy director, or as Mark now called him, the DD, or the old man, was often there, but in a peculiar mode. He had a habit of drifting in, arid sauntering about the room, creaking and humming as usual. Sometimes he came up to the circle by the fire and listened and looked on with a vaguely parental expression on his face, but he seldom said anything, and he never joined their party. He drifted away again, and then perhaps would return an hour later and once more potter about the empty parts of the room, and once more go away. He had never spoken to Mark since the humiliating interview in his study, and Mark learned from the fairy that he was still out of favor.
The old man will thaw in time, but I told you he didn't like people to talk about leaving.
The least satisfactory member of the circle in Mark's eyes was Strake. Strake made no effort to adapt himself to the ribald and realistic tone in which his colleagues spoke. He never drank nor smoked. He would sit silent, nursing a threadbare knee with a lean hand, and turning his large, unhappy eyes from one speaker to another, without attempting to combat them, or to join in the joke when they laughed. Then, perhaps once in the whole evening, something said would start him off, usually something about the opposition of reactionaries in the outer world, and the measures which the NIC would take to deal with it. At such moments he would burst into loud and prolonged speech, threatening, denouncing, prophesying. The strange thing was that the others neither interrupted him nor laughed. There was some deeper unity between this uncouth man and them, which apparently held in check the obvious lack of sympathy. But what it was, Mark did not discover. Sometimes Strake addressed him in particular, talking to Mark's great discomfort and bewilderment about resurrection.
Neither a historical fact nor a fable, young man, but a prophecy. All the miracles, shadows of things to come. Get rid of false spirituality. It's all going to happen here in this world, the only world there is. What did the Master tell us? Heal the sick, cast out devils, raise the dead. We shall. The Son of Man, that is, man himself, full grown, has power to judge the world, to distribute life without end and punishment without end. You shall see, here and now.
It was all very unpleasant. It was on the day after Hengist's funeral that Mark first ventured to walk into the library on his own. Hitherto he had always been supported by Feverstone or Philostrato. He was a little uncertain of his reception, and yet also afraid that if he did not soon assert his right to the entree, this modesty might damage him. He knew that in such matters the error in either direction is equally fatal. One has to guess and take the risk. It was a brilliant success. The circle were all there, and before he had closed the door behind him, all had turned with welcoming faces, and Philostrato had said,
Ecco.
And the fairy,
Here's the very man.
A glow of sheer pleasure passed over Mark's whole body. Never had the fire seemed to burn more brightly, nor the smell of the drinks be more attractive. He was actually being waited for. He was wanted.
How quick can you write 2 leading articles, Mark?
Can you work all night? I have done. What's it all about?
You are satisfied? That's it, the disturbance must go forward at once, yes? That's the joke of it.
She's done her work too well. She hasn't read her Ovid. Ad metum properit simul. Cannot delay if we wished.
What are we talking about?
The disturbances at Edgestow.
Oh, I haven't been following them very much. Are they becoming serious? They're going to become serious, Sonny. And that's the point. The real riot was timed for next week. All this little stuff was only meant to prepare the ground. But it's been going on too well, damn it. The balloon will have to go up tomorrow, or the day after at latest.
Mark glanced in bewilderment from her face to Feverstone's. The latter doubled himself up with laughter.
I think the penny hasn't dropped, Fairy. You surely didn't imagine the Fairy left the initiative with the natives.
You mean she herself is the disturbance?
Yes.
It's all fair and square. You can't put a few 100,000 imported workmen
Not the sort you enrolled.
into a sleepy little hole like Edgestow without having trouble. I mean, there'd have been trouble anyway. As it turns out, I don't believe my boys needed to do anything. But since the trouble was bound to come, there was no harm in seeing it came at the right moment. You mean you've engineered the disturbances?
To do him justice, his mind was reeling from this new revelation, nor was he aware of any decision to conceal his state of mind. In the smugness and intimacy of that circle, he found his facial muscles and his voice, without any conscious volition, taking on the tone of his colleagues.
That's a crude way of putting it.
It makes no difference. This is how things have to be managed.
Quite. It's always done. Anyone who knows police work will tell you. And as I say, the real thing, the big riot, must take place within the next 48 hours. It's nice to get the tip straight from the horse's mouth. I wish I'd got my wife out of the town, though. Where does she live? Up at Sandown? Ah, it'll hardly affect her. In the meantime, you and I have got to get busy about the account of the riot. But what's it all for?
Emergency regulations. Having the powers we want at Edgestow until the government declares the state of emergency exists there.
Exactly. It is folly to talk of peaceful revolutions. Not that the Canaglia would always resist. Often they have to be prodded into it. But until there is the disturbance, the firing, the barricades, no one gets powers to act effectively. There's not enough what you call weight on the boat to steer him.
And the stuff must be all ready to appear in the papers the very day after the riot. That means it must be handed in to the DD by 6 tomorrow morning at latest. But how are we to write it tonight if the thing doesn't even happen till tomorrow at the earliest?
Everyone burst out laughing.
You'll never manage publicity that way, Mark. You surely don't want to wait for a thing to happen before you tell the story of it.
Well, I admit I had a faint prejudice for doing so, not living in Mr. Dunn's sort of time, nor in Looking-Glass land. No good, Sonny. We've got to get on with it at once. Time for one more drink, and you and I had better go upstairs and begin. We'll get them to give us deviled bones and coffee at 2.
This was the first thing Mark had been asked to do, which he himself, before he did it, clearly knew to be criminal. But the moment of his consent almost escaped his notice. Certainly there was no struggle, no sense of turning a corner. There may have been a time in the world's history when such moments fully revealed their gravity, with witches prophesying on a blasted heath, or visible Rubicons to be crossed. But for him, it all slipped past in a chatter of laughter, of that intimate laughter between fellow professionals, which of all earthly powers is strongest to make men do very wicked things before they are yet, individually, very wicked men. A few moments later he was trotting upstairs with the fairy. They passed Coster on the way, and Mark, talking busily to his companion, saw out of the corner of his eye that Coster was watching them. To think he had once been afraid of Coster.
Who has the job of waking the DD up at 6? Probably not necessary. I suppose the old man must sleep sometime, but I've never discovered when he does it.
At 4 o'clock, Mark sat in the fairy's office, rereading the last 2 articles he had written, one for the most respectable of our papers, the other for a more popular organ. This was the only part of the night's work which had anything in it to flatter literary vanity. The earlier hours had been spent in the sterner labor of concocting the news itself. These 2 leaders had been kept for the end, and the ink was still wet. The first was as follows.
While it would be premature to make any final comment on last night's riot at Edgestow, 2 conclusions seem to emerge from the first accounts, which we publish elsewhere, with with a clarity which is not likely to be shaken by subsequent developments. In the first place, the whole episode will administer a rude shock to any complacency which may still lurk among us as to the enlightenment of our own civilization. It must, of course, be admitted that the transformation of a small university town into a center of national research cannot be carried out without some friction, or in some cases of hardship to the local inhabitants. But the Englishman has always had his own quiet and humorous way of dealing with frictions, and has never showed himself unwilling, when the issue is properly put before him, to make sacrifices much greater than those some small alterations of habit and sentiment which progress demands of the people of Edgestow. It is gratifying to note that there is no suggestion in any authoritative quarter that the NICE has in any way exceeded its powers, or failed in that consideration and courtesy which was expected of it. And there is little doubt that the actual starting point of the disturbances was some quarrel, probably in a public house, between one of the NICE workmen and some local Sir Oracle. But as the Stagyrite said long ago, disorders which have trivial occasions have deeper causes, and there seems little doubt that this petty fracas must have been inflamed, if not exploited, by sectional interests or widespread prejudice. It is disquieting to be forced to suspect that the old distrust of planned efficiency and the old jealousy of what is ambiguously called bureaucracy can be so easily, though we hope temporarily, revived. Though at the same time, this very suspicion, by revealing the gaps and weaknesses in our national level of education, emphasizes one of the very diseases which the National Institute exists to cure. That it will cure it, we need have no doubt. The will of the nation is behind this magnificent peace effort, as Mr. Jewell so happily described the Institute, and any ill-informed opposition which ventures to try conclusions with it will be, we hope gently, but certainly firmly, resisted. The second moral to be drawn from last night's events is a more cheering one. The original proposal to provide the NICE with what is misleadingly called its own police force was viewed with distrust in many quarters. Our readers will remember that while not sharing that distrust, we extended to it a certain sympathy. Even the false fears of those who love liberty should be respected as we respect even the ill-grounded anxieties of a mother. At the same time, we insisted that the complexity of modern society rendered it an anachronism to confine the actual execution of the will of society to a body of men whose real function was the prevention and detection of crime. That the police, in fact, must be relieved sooner or later of that growing body of coercive functions which do not properly fall within their sphere. That this problem has been solved by other countries in a manner which proved fatal to liberty and justice by creating a real imperium in imperio is a fact which no one is likely to forget. The so-called police of the NICE, who should rather be called its sanitary executive, is the characteristically English solution. Its relation to the national police cannot, perhaps, be defined with perfect logical accuracy, but as a nation we have never been much enamored of logic. The executive of the NICE has no connection with politics, and if it ever comes into relation with criminal justice, it does so in the gracious role of a rescuer who can remove the criminal from the harsh sphere of punishment into that of remedial treatment. If any doubt as to the value of such a force existed, it has been amply set at rest by the episodes at Edgestow. The happiest relations seem to have been maintained throughout between the officers of the Institute and the National Police, who, but for the assistance of the Institute, would have found themselves faced with an impossible situation. As an eminent police officer observed to one of our representatives this morning, but for the NICE police, things would have taken quite a different turn. If in the light of these events it is found convenient to place the whole Edgestow area under the exclusive control of the institutional police for some limited period, we do not believe that the British people, always realists at heart, will have the slightest objection. A special tribute is due to the female members of the force, who appear to have acted throughout with that mixture of courage and common sense which the last few years have taught us to expect of English women almost as a matter of course. The wild rumours, current in London this morning, of machine gun fire in the streets and casualties by the hundred, remain to be sifted. Probably when accurate details are available, it will be found, in the words of a recent Prime Minister, that when blood flowed, it was generally from the nose.
The second ran thus.
What is happening at Edgestow? That is the question which John Citizen wants to have answered. The institute which has settled at Edgestow is a national institute. That means it is yours and mine. We are not scientists, and we do not pretend to know what the master brains of the institute are thinking. We do know what each man or woman expects of it. We expect a solution of the unemployment problem, the cancer problem, the housing problem, the problems of currency, of war, of education. We expect from it a brighter, cleaner, and fuller life for our children, in which we and they can march ever onward, and develop to the full the urge of life which God has given each one of us. The NICE is the people's instrument for bringing about all the things we fought for. Meanwhile, what is happening at Edgestow? Do you believe this riot arose simply because Mrs. Snooks or Mr. Buggins found that the landlords had sold their shop or their allotment to the NICE? Mrs. Snooks and Mr. Buggins know better. They know that the Institute means more trade in Edgestow, more public amenities, a larger population, a burst of undreamed-of prosperity. I say these disturbances have been engineered. Therefore I ask yet again, what is happening at Edgestow? There are traitors in the camp. I am not afraid to say so, whoever they may be. They may be so-called religious people. They may be financial interests. They may be the old cobweb-spinning professors and philosophers of Edgestow University itself. They may be Jews. They may be lawyers. I don't care who they are, but I have one thing to tell them. Take care. The people of England are not going to stand this. We are not going to have the Institute sabotaged. What is to be done at Edgestow? I say, put the whole place under the institutional police. Some of you may have been to Edgestow for a holiday. If so, you'll know as well as I do what it is like. A little, sleepy country town with half a dozen policemen who have had nothing to do for 10 years but stop cyclists because their lamps have gone out. It doesn't make sense to expect these poor old bobbies to deal with an engineered riot. Last night, the NICE police showed what they could. What I say is, hats off to Miss Hardcastle and her brave boys. Yes, and her brave girls, too. Give them a free hand and let them get on with the job. Cut out the red tape. I have one bit of advice. If you hear anyone backbiting the NICE police, tell him where he gets off. If you hear anyone comparing them to the Gestapo or the Ogpu, tell him you've heard that one before. If you hear anyone talking about the liberties of England, by which he means the liberties of the obscurantists, the Mrs. Grundys, the bishops, and the capitalists, watch that man. He's the enemy. Tell him from me that the NICE is the boxing glove on the democracy's fist, and if he doesn't like it, he'd best get out of the way. Meanwhile, watch Edgestow.
It might be supposed that after enjoying these articles in the heat of composition, Mark would awake to reason, and with it to disgust, when reading through the finished product. Unfortunately, the process had been almost the reverse. He had become more and more reconciled to the job the longer he worked at it. The complete reconciliation came when he fair copied both articles. When a man has crossed the T's and dotted the I's and likes the look of his work, he does not wish it to be committed to the wastepaper bucket. The more often he rereads the articles, the better he likes them. And anyway, the thing was a kind of joke. He had in his mind a picture of himself, old and rich, probably with a peerage, certainly very distinguished, when all the unpleasant side of the NICE, was over, regaling his juniors with wild, unbelievable tales of this present time.
It was a rum show in those early days. I remember once.
And then, too, for a man whose writings had hitherto appeared only in learned periodicals, or at best in books, which only other dons would read, there was an all but irresistible lure in the thought of the daily press, editors waiting for copy, readers all over Europe, something really depending on his words.
The idea of the immense dynamo which had been placed for the moment at his disposal thrilled through his whole being.
It was, after all, not so long ago, that he had been excited by admission to the progressive element in Bracton. But what was the progressive element to this? It wasn't as if he were taken in by the articles himself. He was writing with his tongue in his cheek, a phrase that somehow comforted him by making the whole thing appear like a practical joke. And anyway, if he didn't do it, someone else would. And all the while the child inside him whispered how splendid and how triumphantly grown up it was to be sitting like this, so full of alcohol and yet not drunk, writing, with his tongue in his cheek, articles for great newspapers against time,
with the printer's devil at the door.
and all the inner ring of the NICE depending on him, and nobody ever again having the least right to consider him a non-entity or cipher. Jane stretched out her hand in the darkness, but did not feel the table which ought to have been there at her bed's head. Then, with a shock of surprise, she discovered that she was not in bed at all, but standing. There was utter darkness all around her, and it was intensely cold. Groping, she touched what appeared to be uneven surfaces of stone. The air also had some odd quality about it. Dead air, imprisoned air, it seemed. Somewhere far away, possibly overhead, there were noises which came to her muffled and shuddering as if through earth. So the worst had happened. A bomb had fallen on the house, and she was buried alive. But before she had time to feel the full impact of this idea, she remembered that the war was over. Oh, and all sorts of things had happened since then. She had married Mark. She had seen Alcazan in his cell. She had met Camilla. Then, with great and swift relief, she thought, "It's one of my dreams. It's a piece of news. It'll stop presently. There's nothing to be frightened of." The place, whatever it was, did not seem to be very large. She groped all along one of the rough walls, and then, turning at the corner, struck her foot against something hard. She stooped down and felt. There was a sort of raised platform or table of stone about 3 feet high. And on it, did she dare to explore? But it would be worse not to. She began trying the surface of the table with her hands, and next moment bit her lip to save herself from screaming, for she had touched a human foot. It was a naked foot, and dead, to judge by its coldness. To go on groping seemed the hardest thing she had ever done, but somehow she was impelled to do it. The corpse was clothed in some very coarse stuff, which was also uneven, as though it were heavily embroidered and very voluminous. It must be a very large man, she thought, still groping upward toward his head. On his chest the texture suddenly changed, as if the skin of some hairy animal had been laid over the coarse robe. So she thought at first, then she realized the hair really belonged to a beard. She hesitated about feeling the face. She had a fear lest the man should stir or wake or speak if she did so. She therefore became still for a moment. It was only a dream. She could bear it, but it was so dreary, and it all seemed to be happening so long ago, as if she had slipped through a cleft in the present down into some cold, sunless pit of the remote past. She hoped they wouldn't leave her here long. If only someone would come quickly and let her out. And immediately she had a picture of someone bearded, but also, it was odd, divinely young, someone golden and strong and warm, coming with a mighty earth-shaking tread down into that black place. The dream became chaotic at this point. Jane had an impression that she ought to curtsy to this person, who never actually arrived, though the impression of him lay bright and heavy on her mind, and felt great consternation on realizing that some dim memories of dancing lessons at school were not sufficient to show her how to do so, and at this point she woke. She went into Edgetown immediately after breakfast to hunt, as she now hunted every day, for someone who would replace Mrs. Maggs. At the top of Market Street something happened which finally determined her to go to St. Anne's that very day and by the 10:23 train. She came to a place where a big car was standing beside the pavement, an NICE car. Just as she reached it, a man came out of a shop, cut across her path to speak to the chauffeur of the car, and then got in. He was so close to her that despite the fog, she saw him very clearly, in isolation from all other objects. The background was all gray fog and passing feet, and the harsh sounds of the unaccustomed traffic which now never ceased in Edgestow. She would have known him anywhere. Not Mark's face, nor her own face in a mirror, was by now more familiar. She saw the pointed beard, the pince-nez, the face which somehow reminded her of a waxwork's face. She had no need to think what she would do. Her body, walking quickly past, seemed of itself to have decided that it was heading for the station and thence for St. Anne's. It was something different from fear, though she was frightened too, almost to the point of nausea, that drove her so unerringly forward. It was a total rejection of, or revulsion from, this man on all levels of her being at once. Dreams sank into insignificance compared with the blinding reality of the man's presence. She shuddered to think that their hands might have touched as she passed him. The train was blessedly warm, her compartment empty, the fact of sitting down so delightful. The slow journey through the fog almost sent her to sleep. She hardly thought about St. Anne's until she found herself there. Even as she walked up the steep hill, she made no plans, rehearsed nothing that she meant to say, but only thought of Camilla and Mrs. Dimble. The childish levels, the undersoil of her mind had been turned up. She wanted to be with nice people, away from nasty people, that nursery distinction seeming at the moment more important than any latter categories of good and bad or friend and enemy. She was roused from this state by noticing that it was lighter. She looked ahead. Surely that bend in the road was more visible than it ought to be in such a fog? Or was it only that a country fog was different from a town one? Certainly what had been gray was becoming white, almost dazzlingly white. A few yards further and luminous blue was showing overhead, and the trees cast shadows. She had not seen a shadow for days. And then all of a sudden the enormous spaces of the sky had become visible, and the pale golden sun, And looking back, as she took the turn to the manor, Jane saw that she was standing on the shore of a little green, sunlit island, looking down on a sea of white fog, furrowed and ridged, yet level on the whole, which spread as far as she could see. There were other islands, too. That dark one to the west was the wooded hills above Sandon, where she had picnicked with the Denistons, and the far bigger and brighter one to the north was the many caverned hills, mountains one could nearly call them, in which the wind had its source. She took a deep breath. It was the size of this world above the fog which impressed her. Down in Edgestow all these days one had lived, even when out of doors, as if in a room, for only objects close at hand were visible. She felt she had come near to forgetting how big the sky is and how remote the horizon.